Hello, Night Seekers. Welcome to Nytheric Horror. True scary stories, gentle narration, and peaceful dreams begin here. If you love relaxing horror, please subscribe and join us for more. Now, let's begin. This happened one evening after I had just gotten home from work. I was sitting in my room, located on the second floor of our house, trying to relax and unwind after a long shift. My little brother was downstairs at the time, sitting in front of the television, and our dog was lying just outside my bedroom door, out in the hallway, peacefully asleep as she usually was around that hour. Without any warning at all, our dog suddenly erupted into an intense burst of activity, making all kinds of loud, chaotic noise. She was jumping around frantically, barking sharply, her nails clacking loudly against the hallway floor as she moved, and at one point, she even let out a long, unsettling howl. The sudden shift from her being completely calm and asleep to this frantic, agitated state immediately caught my attention. And I got up from where I was sitting to go check on what exactly was happening with her. Just as I started making my way toward my bedroom door, I heard a voice, clearly male, speaking softly from somewhere out in the hallway, saying something like, "Aw, that's a good girl," in a calm, affectionate tone, almost as though someone were gently praising and trying to calm the dog down. The voice did not sound like my little brother's voice at all. My first assumption, hearing that unfamiliar male voice coming from just outside my door, was that our roommate, a close friend of my father's who lived with us at the time, must have come home early from wherever he had been that day. I called out, saying something along the lines of, "Oh, you're home early," fully expecting to see him standing there in the hallway as I opened my bedroom door. The moment I stepped out into the hallway, though, there was absolutely no one there. No roommate, no visitor, no explanation whatsoever for the voice I had just clearly heard only seconds earlier. The only thing waiting for me out there was our dog, standing completely still now, wagging her tail slowly while staring intently at the empty far end of the hallway, almost as though she could still see or sense something there that I myself could not. Shortly after that, my little brother came storming up the stairs, clearly annoyed, ready to scold me for apparently getting the dog all riled up and causing such a commotion downstairs while he was trying to watch television. But once we actually started talking, comparing notes on what each of us had just individually experienced, it became immediately clear that something far stranger than a simple misunderstanding had just taken place. My brother told me that he too had heard that exact same unfamiliar male voice, and that his own first assumption, just like mine, had been that it must have been either me or our roommate speaking from somewhere upstairs. Realizing that both of us had independently heard the same voice, coming from the same general area, despite neither of us having actually spoken those words ourselves, sent an immediate wave of unease through the both of us. Not wanting to take any chances, we decided to do a full, careful sweep through the entire house together, checking every single room thoroughly. I grabbed my butterfly knife for some sense of protection, while my brother armed himself with his bead gun, and together, cautiously and deliberately, we checked every possible hiding spot throughout the house, every closet, every room, every corner where someone might conceivably be hiding. We found absolutely nobody. No sign of an intruder, no indication that anyone else had actually been inside the house with us at any point that evening. Every door remained securely locked exactly as we had left them, with no evidence anywhere of forced entry or any other explanation for how an unfamiliar voice could have possibly spoken so clearly and calmly right outside my bedroom door, addressing our dog directly in that same moment she had been reacting so intensely to something none of the rest of us could actually see. To this day, thinking back on that entire experience still genuinely gives me a lingering sense of unease. There is something about the specific combination of details from that evening that continues to unsettle me whenever I find myself remembering it. Our dog's sudden, intense reaction, shifting so abruptly from peaceful sleep into that frantic display of jumping, barking, and howling, remains one of the hardest parts of the entire experience to explain away through any ordinary, mundane reasoning. Dogs certainly do react unexpectedly to all kinds of things sometimes, whether it be an unfamiliar sound outside, a passing animal, or some other environmental trigger that we as humans simply cannot perceive ourselves. But the specific timing of her reaction, occurring at the exact same moment that unfamiliar voice spoke directly to her in such a calm, familiar tone, feels far too coincidental to easily dismiss. The voice itself remains the single most unsettling detail from that entire evening. It was not vague or distant, not some faint sound easily mistaken for something else entirely. It was clear, distinct, and unmistakably male, speaking directly and specifically to our dog in that same affectionate, familiar tone you might use when praising a pet you know well. Whoever or whatever was responsible for that voice, it clearly seemed to be addressing our dog directly, almost as though it were physically present there in the hallway alongside her in that exact moment. What makes this experience especially difficult to simply write off as some kind of shared imagination or misunderstanding is the fact that both my brother and I independently heard that same voice at the same time from two completely separate locations within the house. I was upstairs in my room while he was downstairs in front of the television, and yet both of us clearly heard that same unfamiliar male voice. Both of us initially assuming it must have been each other, or possibly our roommate returning home early. If it had been some kind of isolated auditory experience, limited only to myself, I might have been more inclined afterward to write it off as some kind of momentary confusion or mishearing. But given that my brother heard the exact same thing independently, from an entirely different part of the house, it becomes far more difficult to dismiss the experience as simple imagination. I have also thought extensively, in the time since that evening, about our dog's specific behavior in the moments immediately following that voice. Rather than continuing to bark aggressively or show any further signs of active distress once I actually stepped out into the hallway myself, she instead settled almost immediately into a calm, tail-wagging state, staring intently at that same empty section of hallway as though watching something or someone that remained completely invisible to both my brother and me. That specific behavior, the shift from frantic agitation to calm, focused attention directed at one particular empty spot, has always struck me as especially significant, almost as though whatever had been present with her in that hallway had not necessarily been threatening or hostile in nature, but rather simply present, watching, and interacting with her in some way neither my brother nor I could perceive ourselves. Searching the entire house together afterward, armed with whatever makeshift protection we had immediately available, and finding absolutely no trace of anyone else present, only deepened the unease surrounding that entire evening. Every door remained locked, every window secured, with no possible explanation for how an actual physical person could have entered the house, spoken directly to our dog in that hallway, and then disappeared again so completely and quickly, all within the short span of time between when I first heard that voice and when I actually managed to step outside my bedroom door. Since that night, I have found myself paying much closer attention to our dog's behavior, especially whenever she seems to react unexpectedly to something in an empty room or hallway, wondering each time whether she might be sensing or perceiving something that neither my brother nor I are able to detect ourselves. That particular evening remains firmly lodged in my memory, standing out clearly as one of the strangest, most unexplainable experiences either my brother or I have ever gone through together within that house. We have talked about that specific night many times since it happened, usually whenever the topic of strange, unexplainable experiences comes up between us, each time returning to the same unanswered questions. Who or what was actually present in that hallway that evening? Calm and familiar enough to address our dog so gently and affectionately, yet completely undetectable to either of us, despite how thoroughly we searched the entire house immediately afterward. Neither of us has ever managed to come up with any kind of satisfying, rational explanation that fully accounts for everything we both individually experienced that night, and to this day, thinking back on it still gives me that same lingering, unsettled feeling, that quiet, persistent spookiness that has never fully faded, no matter how much time has passed since it actually happened. A few years ago, I found myself home alone one night, sitting in my living room watching television, trying to relax after a long day. At some point during the evening, the doorbell suddenly rang, cutting through the quiet stillness of the house. Whenever I hear the doorbell ring, especially during those times when I happen to be home completely alone, I tend to approach answering it with a fair amount of caution, never simply opening the door without first checking who might actually be standing outside. I got up from where I was sitting and walked quietly toward the front door, deliberately choosing not to turn on the porch light before looking through the peephole. My reasoning behind that decision was simple. By keeping the porch light off, whoever was standing outside would have no way of knowing for certain whether anyone was actually home, giving me a small advantage in assessing the situation safely before deciding whether to respond at all. I leaned in close to the peephole and looked out into the darkness beyond my front door. It was genuinely quite dark outside that night, making it difficult to make out most details clearly. But despite that darkness, I could still see something. A small figure standing roughly 3 to 4 feet in height, though describing it as a figure almost feels too generous, given how indistinct and shapeless it actually appeared. It looked more like a solid dark blob of some kind, its exact shape difficult to fully define or describe with any real precision. What I could make out clearly, though, was movement. This figure appeared to be performing some kind of slow, deliberate dancing motion, dipping downward rhythmically before rising again, all while extending what I can only describe as arms outward on either side, moving them in a slow, graceful, oscillating pattern. If I had to compare the motion to something more familiar, it reminded me of watching a person gracefully moving their arms up and down like a pair of wings, slow and deliberate, almost hypnotic in its consistency. Despite the darkness surrounding it outside, this particular figure appeared notably more opaque and solid compared to the deep shadows around it, which is exactly what allowed me to make out its movement so clearly through that small peephole, even without any porch light illuminating the area directly. I watched this strange, silent dance continue for a few full seconds, completely transfixed and unable to look away initially, before the sheer unsettling nature of what I was witnessing finally became too much for me to continue watching directly. I pulled back from the peephole, needing a moment to collect myself and process exactly what I had just seen. After taking a few seconds to steady my nerves and gather whatever courage I could manage, I forced myself to lean back in and look through the peephole one more time, half expecting, and honestly half hoping, that whatever I had seen would somehow have a more mundane, explainable presence waiting there the second time around. Instead, when I looked again, there was nothing there at all. The strange dancing figure had completely vanished, leaving behind nothing but the same dark empty porch and yard that I would normally expect to see on any ordinary night. To this day, I still do not have any solid, rational explanation for exactly what that figure actually was. Whenever I find myself thinking back on that particular night, replaying that strange, slow, deliberate dancing motion in my mind, I still feel a distinct wave of unease pass through me. The same lingering fear I felt in that very moment, standing at my own front door, peering out through that small peephole into the darkness beyond. Looking back on the experience now, with some additional time and distance separating me from that actual night, certain specific details continue to stand out as particularly difficult to explain away using any conventional reasoning. The height of the figure, standing somewhere between 3 and 4 feet tall, does not match any animal I can reasonably think of that might have wandered up to my front porch that night. It was too tall and too oddly proportioned to easily match any common household pet, and far too small to represent an actual adult human standing at my door. The specific quality of its movement remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire memory as well. Animals do not typically move in that kind of slow, graceful, deliberately rhythmic way, dipping and extending their limbs outward in such a consistent, almost performative pattern. If anything, the motion reminded me far more of an intentional, controlled dance than any kind of natural, instinctual animal movement. That specific detail, the deliberate, almost graceful quality to its motion, is part of what has made this particular experience so difficult for me to simply write off as an unusual animal or some kind of trick of shadow and darkness. I also continue to find the detail about its opacity significant whenever I think back on the entire experience. Everything else outside my house that night was consistent with what you would expect from ordinary nighttime darkness. Shadows blending naturally into the surrounding environment, difficult to distinguish clearly from one another without additional lighting. Yet this particular figure stood out distinctly from that same darkness, more solid, more defined, more visually present than anything else I could make out through that peephole. That contrast is part of what allowed me to actually observe its movements so clearly in the first place, despite the otherwise poor visibility outside. The fact that it disappeared so completely and so quickly within the short span of just a few seconds while I briefly looked away adds yet another unsettling layer to the entire experience. If it had genuinely been some kind of ordinary animal or a person engaged in some strange behavior on my porch, I would have expected to still see some trace of it upon looking again, whether it be the figure itself moving away or at least some indication of movement or sound as it left. Instead, there was nothing. No trace, no sound, no visual indication of movement, just a completely empty porch, as though whatever had been there moments earlier had simply ceased to exist the instant I stopped watching it directly. I have thought about that night many times since it happened, trying to settle on some kind of satisfying, rational explanation that might account for everything I witnessed. I have wondered whether it could have possibly been some kind of unusual, misidentified animal, perhaps something unfamiliar to me that happened to move in a way I simply was not expecting or familiar with. I have also considered whether exhaustion, poor lighting, or some combination of environmental factors might have combined to create a misleading visual impression that my mind then interpreted as something more deliberate and unsettling than what was actually happening. None of those potential explanations, though, have ever fully satisfied me or eased the distinct unease I still feel whenever I think back on that specific memory. The clarity with which I was able to observe that slow, deliberate dance-like motion, combined with its unusual size, its distinct opacity against the surrounding darkness, and its sudden, complete disappearance moments later, continues to set this experience apart from any simple, easily explainable encounter with an ordinary nighttime animal or shadow. Since that night, I will admit that I approach answering my door after dark with even more caution than I already had beforehand. And I find myself occasionally glancing toward the peephole, even when I have not heard the doorbell ring at all, half wondering and half dreading whether I might catch sight of that same strange dancing figure standing out there once again, waiting silently in the darkness beyond my front door. I do not know, even now, what that figure truly was, whether some kind of unusual animal, some trick of shadow and darkness that my mind simply misinterpreted, or something else entirely that defies any easy, rational explanation. What I do know is that the memory of that night has never fully faded. And even now, years later, simply thinking back on that slow, graceful, unsettling dance performed silently on my own front porch is enough to send a distinct chill straight through me all over again. This happened back in the late 80s or early 90s, during a time when I was only around 6 or 7 years old. I was at home that particular night with my older sister, who was around 14 or 15 at the time. We had grown up together in a small town in Texas, the kind of small, tightly connected community where pretty much everyone knew everybody else. My parents frequently left my sister in charge of babysitting me whenever they went out for the evening, and given our age gap, the two of us generally got along quite well together during those nights alone. On this specific night, it was around 8 in the evening during the winter months, and even though we lived in a desert region, those winter nights could get surprisingly cold. It was already fully dark outside, and the two of us were sitting together in the common room of our house, since that was where the television was located. We were watching one of those hour-long news programs, something along the lines of 60 Minutes or 48 Hours or Hard Copy. The kind of gritty, in-depth news specials that covered serious crimes in detail. Things like trafficking, murders, and kidnappings. Essentially a much darker, more serious version of the typical made-for-television specials. The particular episode we were watching that night followed a fairly typical, unsettling formula. It centered on a quiet man living next door to another family who had, without warning, gone on a violent rampage inside his neighbor's house, seriously harming them and ultimately kidnapping their young daughter. Now, an important detail about our house's common room layout matters quite a bit for the rest of this story. The door leading out to our backyard was a large glass door, part of an entire wall made up of floor-to-ceiling windows. Beyond that glass, at night, there was nothing but complete darkness unless the outdoor backlight happened to be switched on, which that particular night it was not. On the opposite side of the room was our front door, situated within a small entryway. Unlike the back door, this front door was solid, meaning you could not see through it to whatever might be waiting on the other side, though it did have an additional glass storm door installed just outside of it. About 45 minutes into the program, right around the point where the show was discussing the ongoing manhunt for this particular violent individual, our front door suddenly erupted into a rapid, forceful series of loud bangs. Both my sister and I jumped straight up off the floor, screaming immediately and involuntarily out of pure shock and fear. Then, just as suddenly as it started, complete silence returned to the house. At that point, the only sources of light remaining on anywhere in the house were the kitchen light further down the hallway from where we were sitting, along with a dim, flickering glow coming from the television screen itself. We both tried desperately to reassure each other, suggesting that maybe something out on the porch, perhaps one of our planters or the old rocking chair we kept out there, had simply been blown against the door by the wind. West Texas is known for producing genuinely powerful, unpredictable winds, so that explanation felt at least somewhat reasonable in the moment. A minute or two of tense silence passed, both of us holding on to each other tightly, still riding out the intense adrenaline surge from those initial loud bangs. Just as we were finally starting to relax slightly, ready to convince ourselves that everything really was safe after all, we heard the outer glass storm door on our front entrance close shut. That single sound sent an immediate wave of dread through both of us. Someone would have had to physically open that storm door first in order to actually bang directly on our solid front door the way we had just heard. This was not simply the wind. Someone had genuinely been standing right there on our front porch. Both my sister and I remained completely frozen in place, sitting together in the middle of the floor exactly where we had been watching television only minutes earlier. My sister eventually managed to crawl over toward the television and switch it off, using that old metal dial television sets used to have back then, producing a distinct, somewhat loud thunk as she turned it. Now the room was lit only by that same faint kitchen light glowing down the hallway. I honestly do not remember exactly how much time passed after that, both of us remaining frozen, my sister still crouched down near the now silent television. We kept exchanging quick, frightened glances with each other, then looking back toward the front door, waiting, terrified, for something else to happen. I remember this next part with startling clarity, even all these years later. I was sitting on my knees, resting back on my heels, and at some point, I turned around to look toward the back wall, made entirely of windows and that large glass door leading out to our backyard. That is when I both heard and saw the doorknob on that back door begin to turn. It had been locked at the knob, though not secured with an additional deadbolt. The knob rattled slightly, as though someone outside were gently, carefully testing whether the door might open. Neither my sister nor I made a single sound. We simply held our breath completely, too terrified to move or speak. Then, without warning, an explosion of loud, forceful banging erupted from that same back door, someone violently jerking the door handle back and forth, trying desperately to force their way inside. The entire wall of windows surrounding that door vibrated intensely with each violent jerk, and I remember watching my own faint reflection in that glass blur and sharpen repeatedly with every single forceful movement against the door. My sister completely lost her composure at that point, screaming as loud as she possibly could. I remained frozen, still sitting there on the floor, unable to move or react in any way. She got up, grabbed hold of me, and essentially dragged me along with her into her bedroom. She slammed her bedroom door shut behind us and immediately began piling anything she could find in front of it, starting with her own mattress, desperately trying to barricade us inside that room as securely as possible. Thankfully, she remembered we had a cordless phone in her room, one of those old, heavy beige plastic phones with the long metal antenna sticking out of the top. In her panic, she could not remember our local sheriff's actual phone number, so instead, she simply hit the redial button, reaching one of her friends who had called earlier that same day. Through broken, gasping sobs, she managed to explain that someone was actively trying to break into our house and that they needed to get help there immediately. I distinctly remember the specific, urgent language she used in that moment, the kind of intense, unfiltered language that tends to slip out during genuine moments of panic and fear, regardless of how young or old you happen to be. I remained curled up on the floor the entire time, unable to stop shaking uncontrollably. Neither of us heard anything further from either door after that point. We simply waited there together, terrified, until we finally saw the headlights of a car pulling up outside, belonging to my sister's friend along with her parents, who had rushed straight over the moment they heard what was happening. To this day, we never found out who had actually been at either door that night. or why they had been trying so desperately to get inside our house. There were no clear, definitive signs of an actual attempted break in anywhere around the property. Aside from a couple of small scuff marks near the bottom of the back door, marks that neither my sister nor I could say with any certainty had not already been there beforehand. Nothing quite like that specific incident has ever happened to either my sister or me again. Not before that night, and not since. But I can say with absolute certainty that neither of us have ever again forgotten to double-check that every single door in our house is properly locked before settling in for the night. Even now, decades removed from that particular evening, certain details from that night remain seared into my memory with startling clarity. The sound of that initial banging on the front door, so sudden and violent that it sent both of us leaping up off the floor in pure, reflexive terror. The unsettling realization that followed shortly afterward, that whoever had been banging on that door must have deliberately opened our storm door first, meaning we were not simply dealing with wind or some harmless environmental explanation. The rattling of that back doorknob, slow and deliberate, followed almost immediately by that explosive, violent jerking against the door itself, rattling the entire surrounding wall of windows with such force that I could watch my own reflection blur and sharpen with each individual jerk. I think, too, about how young I actually was during all of this, only 6 or 7 years old. Far too young to fully process or rationalize what was happening around me in any meaningful way. My sister, only a few years older herself, still managed to react quickly enough to get us both to relative safety, barricading her bedroom door and reaching out for help, despite her own overwhelming fear in that moment. Looking back now, as an adult, I have an even deeper appreciation for how she managed to hold herself together well enough to protect both of us during those terrifying, uncertain minutes. We have talked about that night many times over the years since it happened, always circling back to the same unresolved questions. Who was actually outside our house that particular evening, trying so aggressively to force their way inside first, through the front door, and then the back? Was it somehow connected to the very crime story we had been watching on television only moments before it all began? Some strange, unsettling coincidence, or something else entirely that neither of us has ever managed to figure out. We never received any real answers, and likely never will at this point, so many years removed from that single terrifying night. But the fear from that experience has never fully faded, remaining just as vivid and unsettling in memory now as it felt in that very moment, huddled together on the floor of our childhood home, watching our own reflections blur and shake against the violently rattling wall of glass. I used to live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment upstairs in a building where my significant other lived in the apartment directly below me. It was not a large place at all. There was a small living room, an open kitchen, one bedroom, a bathroom, a closet, and a tiny balcony that I almost never used. During the day, the apartment felt completely normal. It was small enough that I could pretty much see most of it from one place, and because I lived alone, I knew exactly how I left things. I knew which lights I turned on and off. I knew which doors were open. I knew when something had been moved. There was not much space for surprises. That was one of the reasons what happened there bothered me so much. At night, I started hearing footsteps. The first few times, I tried to explain them away. Old buildings make noise, floors shift, pipes move, neighbors walk around. Sound travels strangely between apartments. I knew all of that. But these sounds did not seem random. They sounded like someone was walking across my living room. Not running, not pacing quickly, just walking. The pattern was always strange. The footsteps would seem to start somewhere in the living room, move across the floor toward the small balcony, then turn around and come back. Then sometimes they would do it again, back and forth, across the room, toward the balcony, then back. The first times I heard it, I was usually in bed. My bedroom was close enough to the living room that I could hear the movement clearly. I would be lying there in the dark, trying to sleep, and suddenly I would hear what sounded like weight moving across the floor. Step, 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 then a pause. Then the sound moving back the other way. At first, my mind went straight to an intruder. That is the obvious fear when you live alone. Someone had gotten into the apartment. Maybe the balcony door had been left unlocked. Maybe someone had a key. Maybe I had somehow failed to lock the front door. I would lie completely still and listen. The problem was that I never heard anything else. No drawer opening, no cabinet, no whispering, no door handle moving, no objects falling, just footsteps. That almost made it worse. If someone had broken in to steal something, you would expect them to do something. They would move around with a purpose. Open cabinets, search drawers, try doors. Instead, this sounded like someone simply walking across my living room for no reason, back and forth. Sometimes the sounds happened while I was in the bathroom, too. That was almost worse, because the bathroom felt smaller and more trapped. I would be inside with the door closed and suddenly hear movement outside. Footsteps crossing the living room. At those moments, I would stop whatever I was doing and listen. My whole body would become still. Someone is out there. That thought would hit immediately. Then I would remind myself that I lived alone. The apartment was supposed to be empty. I should have been the only person there. I wish I could say that I was brave and immediately went out to investigate. I was not, especially at the beginning. When the footsteps first started, I was terrified. If I was in bed, I would pull the blankets around myself and stay there. I know hiding under blankets does not actually protect you from anything. If there had been a real intruder in the apartment, a comforter was not going to save me. But fear is not always logical. The bed felt safe. The covers felt safe. Leaving the bedroom and walking into the room where I had just heard footsteps felt impossible. So I stayed still. I listened. Eventually, the sounds would stop. Then I would lie awake for a long time, wondering whether they had really happened. In the morning, the apartment looked normal. Nothing missing. Nothing moved. No broken locks. No open windows. No sign that anyone had entered. During daylight, it was much easier to convince myself that I had misunderstood what I heard. Maybe it came from downstairs. Maybe someone outside was walking near the building. Maybe the walls carried noise strangely. Then night would come again. The apartment would become quiet. And I would hear it. Someone walking across the living room. The fact that my significant other heard it too made things harder to dismiss. At the time, they lived in the apartment directly below mine and would sometimes stay the night with me. I was relieved to have someone else there because being alone had started making me nervous. I thought maybe when another person was in the apartment, I would stop imagining things. Then one night, they heard it too. I did not have to convince them. They heard the same kind of movement. Footsteps across the living room. Someone walking toward the balcony, and then back again. That changed the situation for me. If I had been the only person hearing it, I could have blamed my imagination. Maybe I was half asleep. Maybe stress was making normal apartment noises sound like walking. But now another person was hearing the same thing. That did not prove anything supernatural. Sound can still travel through a building. We could both hear the same neighbor. We could both hear pipes. But at least I knew I was not simply inventing the sound. There was something there to hear. The question was what? The apartment itself, never showed obvious signs of being disturbed. That is what kept me from calling the police or completely losing my mind. If I had come home to a broken lock or open window, I would have known someone had been inside. Instead, everything stayed normal. The footsteps happened, then stopped. Nothing else followed. Over time, I became almost used to them. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but familiar. There is a strange point where something frightening becomes part of your routine. You hear it enough times and your reaction changes. The first time, your heart feels like it is going to explode. The 10th time, you still get scared, but another part of your mind says, here we go again. That was where I was after a while. Then one night, something happened that frightened me more than the footsteps ever had. I came home late. I do not remember exactly where I had been, but it was late enough that the building was quiet. I climbed the stairs toward my apartment. Everything seemed normal. I reached the door, unlocked it, opened it. Then I froze. I did not hear anything. That is important. There was no footstep, no voice, no movement. I simply stood in the doorway and immediately felt that someone was inside. It was overwhelming. You know that strange awareness people sometimes have when another person is nearby? Maybe you walk into a room and can somehow tell someone is standing behind you before they speak. Or you suddenly look up because you feel someone watching. It is difficult to explain. Maybe the brain picks up tiny sounds or changes in the environment that we do not consciously notice. Whatever causes it, most people have probably felt something like it at least once. That was what hit me, only much stronger. Someone was in my apartment. I knew it. Not thought. Knew, at least, that was how it felt. I stayed in the doorway for a moment. My whole body was telling me not to go farther. I looked into the apartment. Nothing moved. The living room appeared empty. Then I noticed something else. The balcony light was on. That stopped me completely. I almost never used the balcony. It was tiny. There was really no reason for me to go out there regularly. Because I did not use it, I also did not use the balcony light. And I knew I had not turned it on. But there it was, glowing. I stared at it. Now the feeling that someone was inside had something physical attached to it. A light was on that should not have been on. My first thought was that someone had entered the apartment while I was gone. Maybe they were still inside. That seemed much more possible than a ghost. And honestly, a real intruder was more frightening in that moment. I had no idea whether someone was hiding in the bedroom, the bathroom, the closet. Maybe they had heard me unlock the door and were staying quiet. I should probably have backed away and called the police. That would have been the smart thing. Instead, I walked in. I do not know what I was thinking. Fear can make people do strange things. Sometimes you run. Sometimes you freeze. Sometimes you decide you are suddenly qualified to clear an apartment by yourself. Apparently, that night I chose the third option. I quickly turned on the lights, one after another. The apartment became bright. That helped a little. Shadows disappeared. The living room was empty. I could see the balcony through the glass. No one was out there. That should have made me feel better. It did not. Because now I knew that if someone was inside, they were somewhere I could not see. The bedroom, the bathroom, or the closet. I moved into the kitchen. The kitchen was open to the rest of the apartment, so from there I could still see much of the living room. I grabbed a knife. I had no idea what I was doing. I did not know how to fight with a knife. I had no training. I had never been in that kind of confrontation. But having something in my hand made me feel less helpless. That was all. I gripped it and stood there listening. Silence. The apartment felt wrong. I still had that strong sensation that someone was nearby. The balcony light remained on. I could see there was nobody on the balcony. That removed one possibility. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. That left the rooms I could not see. I started checking them. I do not remember the exact order. Probably the bathroom first, maybe the bedroom. But I remember the closet most clearly. For some reason, the closet was the worst. I did not want to open it. That fear did not even make logical sense. A living person hiding in the bedroom would be just as dangerous as a person hiding in a closet. But closets are different when you are scared. They are enclosed, dark. You cannot see inside until you are close. You have to stand right in front of the door. If someone is hiding there, they have the advantage. I remember approaching it with a knife in my hand. My heart was pounding. Part of me was completely prepared to see a person when I opened the door. Another part of me already seemed to know I would not. That is difficult to explain. Even while I was armed and checking the apartment as if I expected an intruder, there was a deeper feeling that this was not a living person. Maybe that was because nothing had been disturbed. Maybe it was because of the footsteps I had already been hearing for so long. Maybe my brain had already decided the apartment had something strange in it. Whatever the reason, I felt terrified of opening that closet, but I also expected it to be empty. I opened it. Nothing. No person. No movement. No hidden stranger. I checked everything. The bedroom. The bathroom. The closet. There was nobody in the apartment. I did not find an open window. I did not find someone hiding behind a door. I did not see anyone on the balcony. Nothing had been stolen. There was no sign that someone had broken in. But the light was still on. That bothered me. I knew I had not turned it on. I am not saying it was impossible that I forgot. Memory is not perfect. People do things and forget. Maybe I had used the balcony light earlier and simply did not remember. Maybe there was an electrical problem. Maybe the switch had been bumped somehow. There are ordinary explanations. I understand that. But standing there that night, I felt certain. I had not turned that light on, and the feeling in the apartment did not disappear after I searched it. That might have been the strangest part. Usually, when you think someone is in your home and then check every room, your body relaxes. You prove the fear wrong. No one is there. The doors are secure. Everything is fine. But I did not feel fine. The apartment remained heavy. Occupied, that sense of another presence stayed with me for a while. I would sit in the living room and feel like I was not alone. Nothing visible was there. But my body refused to believe the space was empty. I kept looking toward the balcony. That balcony became the focus because of the footsteps. They always seemed to move in that direction. Across the living room. Toward the balcony. Then back. Now the balcony light had somehow been left on while I was away. That connection bothered me. Why the balcony? I almost never used it. Was there something about that part of the apartment? Was the sound really coming from somewhere outside and carrying in? Was there another apartment or structural space near it that explained everything? I never found out. The footsteps continued. That is important. The strange night with the light was not the end. I kept hearing them afterward. Sometimes I would be in bed. Sometimes in the bathroom. The pattern was familiar. Someone walking across my little living room. Toward the balcony. Then back. I became more curious over time, but I never became comfortable enough to stand in the living room waiting for it. Part of me wanted to catch the source. I wanted to know whether a floorboard was making the sound. Maybe heating or cooling caused the wood to shift in sequence. Maybe vibrations from downstairs created the illusion of footsteps. Old buildings can make surprisingly human sounds. But another part of me did not want an answer if the answer turned out to be something I could not explain. That is the strange thing about paranormal experiences. People say they want proof. But when something happens in your own home, what you really want is normality. You do not want proof that your apartment is haunted. You want the pipes to be weird. You want the neighbors to be noisy. You want the floor to creak in a pattern. Anything ordinary is better. I tried to hold on to those ordinary explanations. My significant other lived downstairs. Maybe some of the sounds came from there. Maybe footsteps downstairs traveled upward and sounded like they were in my room. But when my so stayed upstairs with me, they heard it too. We were both inside the apartment. The sounds still seemed to cross the living room. That did not completely eliminate the building explanation, but it made it harder for me to ignore. Sometimes I wondered whether the apartment had a history. I never really investigated it deeply. Maybe I should have. Maybe someone had lived there for years before me. Maybe something had happened in the building. Or maybe absolutely nothing had. Old buildings do not need tragic histories to make strange sounds. Sometimes a noisy apartment is just a noisy apartment. But the emotional part of the experience was what stayed with me. Especially that night when I came home. I can still remember opening the front door. One foot still outside. The apartment in front of me. And suddenly, knowing someone was there. I did not see anyone. There was no obvious clue at first. Just that feeling. Then, I saw the balcony light. That made everything worse. I think about how easily the situation could have become dangerous if there really had been an intruder. Running into the kitchen for a knife was not necessarily smart. I could have been walking directly towards someone hiding. I could have trapped myself. Looking back, I should have backed away and gotten help. But in that moment, I was acting on instinct. My home had been violated, or at least that was what I believed. I wanted to know who was inside. The knife gave me courage. Not skill, just courage. That difference matters. When I think about the closet, I can still feel the fear, the handle, the closed door, my hand holding the knife. The idea that I might pull it open and come face to face with someone. Then the relief when there was nothing, followed immediately by a different kind of fear. If no one was there, why did the apartment feel occupied? Why was the light on? And what had I been hearing at night? Feelings do not prove anything. I know that. A sense of presence can happen for many reasons. Stress, anxiety, fatigue, environmental cues. The brain is constantly processing information we do not consciously notice. And sometimes it makes us feel danger even when nothing is there. I am not claiming that the feeling itself proves a ghost was in my apartment. It does not. But the feeling was real. That is what I mean when I talk about it. I did not casually wonder whether someone might be inside. My body reacted as though someone definitely was. There was no doubt in the moment. That is why I grabbed the knife. That is why I checked every room. It was real enough to change my behavior. Then there was the balcony light. That is more difficult for me. I know people forget lights. I know electrical switches can fail. Maybe there was some explanation I never discovered. But I still know how rarely I used that balcony. It was not part of my normal routine. There was no reason for that light to be on, and I was certain I had not left it that way. The footsteps were similar. I cannot prove what caused them. But I know they happened. I know another person heard them too. That means at least the sound was not only in my imagination. What produced the sound is a different question. Maybe someone living nearby. Maybe the building. Maybe something else, I do not know. I lived there long enough that the experiences became part of the apartment itself in my memory. When I think about that place now, I do not first remember the kitchen or the bedroom. I remember lying under the blankets, listening. Step, step, step across the living room. Pause, then back. I remember staying completely still and hoping it would stop. I remember my soul hearing it and confirming that I was not the only one. I remember coming home late, climbing the stairs, unlocking the door, that immediate sense that somebody was waiting inside. Then the balcony light, that stupid light. Something so small, but in that moment it felt like evidence. Someone had been there. I walked inside, turned everything on, grabbed the knife, checked the balcony. Empty, bedroom empty, bathroom empty, closet empty. The apartment was completely empty, at least physically, and somehow that did not help. I almost think it would have been easier if I found a normal explanation. Maybe a neighbor's kid somehow got inside. Maybe a maintenance person had entered without telling me. That would have been upsetting, but understandable. Instead, I found nothing. No sign of entry. No person. No explanation. Just the light. And the feeling. Then later, the footsteps came back. That is why I never completely dismissed what happened. If it had only been the feeling that one night, I would probably say I frightened myself. If it had only been the balcony light, I would say I forgot turning it on. If it had only been the footsteps, I would blame the building. But all of it together stayed with me. Repeated footsteps. Another witness. An unused balcony light turning up on when I knew I had not switched it on. That overwhelming sense of another presence. None of those things individually proves anything. Together, they created an apartment I never fully trusted. Eventually, I moved out. I cannot say I was sad to leave that part behind. There is something exhausting about not completely feeling alone in your own home. Living by yourself is supposed to mean privacy. You close the door, and the space belongs to you. You know that whatever sound happens inside came from you. When that certainty disappears, home becomes a different place. I would lie in bed and think about the living room on the other side of the wall. I would picture someone crossing it slowly, toward the balcony, back, toward the balcony. Back, I never saw who was walking. Maybe there was no one. Maybe there never had been. But the sound was convincing enough that I spent nights hiding under my blankets. And the feeling when I opened that door was strong enough that I ran into my kitchen for a weapon. Even now, I try to be reasonable about it. I do not say, there was definitely a ghost. I do not know that. I do not know what caused the footsteps. I do not know why the light was on. I do not know why I felt someone there. Maybe there are explanations for every part. But I also do not pretend nothing happened. Something did. At the very least, something made footsteps loud enough for two people to hear. Something left a light on that I never used. And something about that apartment made every instinct in my body tell me I was not alone when I opened the door that night. The worst part was the closet. I still think about that sometimes. Standing there with a knife I did not know how to use, knowing I had already checked most of the apartment. Knowing that if a living person was hiding anywhere, that was one of the last places left. Reaching for the door. Opening it. Nothing I should have relaxed. Instead, the emptiness felt wrong, because some part of me had already expected it. I think that was the moment I accepted that whatever I was afraid of was probably not a person. Whether that belief was right or not, I cannot say. All I know is that the apartment stayed empty. The footsteps did not. And I never figured out who or what kept walking across my living room toward a balcony I almost never used. This happened when I was around 11 or 12 years old, and even now it is one of the creepiest things I have ever experienced. For years afterward, well into my teenage years, I would sometimes think about that place and feel the same fear all over again. At the time, my parents had recently separated and were in the process of getting divorced. They sold the house we had been living in, and my mother and I had to move somewhere else. We ended up renting a place on a farm a few miles away. The road itself was strange. It was called Mitchell Road, named after the farmer who had once owned most of the land in that area. Almost nobody seemed to know the road existed unless they already lived there or had some reason to go there. It was not a normal neighborhood road. It was about a mile long, narrow, winding, and mostly uphill. Dense New York forest surrounded much of it, and when you first turned onto it, it felt like you were leaving the normal world behind. The farther you went, the fewer signs of regular life you saw. About half a mile up the road, there was a pond. Near the pond stood a really nice house with carefully maintained bushes and a large, beautiful yard. It almost looked out of place compared with the rest of the road because everything around it felt much more rural and isolated. Another half-mile uphill was a large horse farm. There was a barn and house on the right side. Our place was across from it. The house my mother and I moved into was actually a restored barn. It had been connected to a huge yellow farmhouse that had been divided into two separate homes, with two other families living there. The property around us was spread out in a strange way. Along the small driveway, there was a large trailer on the right side. Farther back, there was an area where cows had apparently once been slaughtered. After that stood another house with another family. If you kept going beyond all of those buildings, you eventually reached a long driveway, probably about half a mile, that led to our landlord's house. His place was buried deep in the woods. The entire area felt hidden. That is the best way I can describe it. You could be only a few miles away from normal roads, stores, and houses, but once you went far enough up Mitchell Road, it felt like nobody would know you were there. As a kid already dealing with my parents splitting up and moving to a completely unfamiliar place, I did not like it. There was something creepy about the entire property from the beginning. Maybe some of that came from my age. Maybe I was already stressed because my life had changed so quickly. But even during the day, there were parts of that road and property that made me uncomfortable. At night, it was much worse. My bedroom was upstairs. I had a window that looked down toward the road leading to our house and across the open fields below us. The view during the daytime was actually pretty impressive. You could see the land falling away toward the lower parts of the road, the fields, trees, and other houses farther down. There was one thing in the field that always stood out: a huge crucifix. It was massive. I would guess it was around 25 feet tall, maybe more. It was made from some kind of metal and looked white or silver, with blue trim. My mother and I both thought it was strange, but not completely unbelievable for the area. There were a lot of very religious people around where we lived. Large crosses, religious signs, and other displays were not unheard of. So even though the crucifix looked unusual standing alone in the open field, we did not think too much about it. It was simply another weird part of an already strange property. We had only been living there for about a week when something happened that completely changed the way I saw the place. One night, I was asleep in my upstairs bedroom. I do not know exactly what time it was. It had to be late enough that everyone around us was asleep. Something woke me up. At first, I did not know what it was. Then I realized there was light moving through my bedroom. Not normal moonlight. Not headlights from a car. It had a strange pulsing quality. The room would become brighter, then darker, then brighter again. My first thought was that the house was on fire. That was how strong the light seemed. I sat up quickly. For a few seconds, I was terrified that flames were somewhere outside my bedroom. Then I noticed something important. I could see the shadows of tree branches moving across my walls and floor. That meant the light was not coming from inside the house. It was outside, behind the trees. I got out of bed and walked toward the window. My bed was directly underneath it, so I only had to stand up and look outside. I wish I had not. Even now, decades later, I can still picture what I saw. The giant cross in the field was completely lit up. There was enough light around it that I could clearly see part of the field. The crucifix itself seemed almost bright against the darkness. Around it were several small fires. They were not one big bonfire. They looked like separate patches or circles of flame burning around the area. The firelight kept changing, which explained the pulsing glow that had woken me. At first, I just stared. I could not understand what I was looking at. Then I noticed movement outside the fires. Shapes were moving around the cross. At first, they were difficult to make out because they would move in and out of the darkness. I kept staring. Eventually, my eyes focused enough that I could see what they were. People. There were people out in the field, but they were not simply standing around. They were on horses. The horses moved around the edge of the light while the riders passed through the glow from the fires. That was when I saw what the riders were wearing. Black robes, long, dark clothing that covered most of their bodies, and on their heads were pointed hoods. I remember my brain almost refusing to understand what my eyes were seeing. I was 11 or 12. I had just moved to this isolated farm. It was the middle of the night, and outside my bedroom window, in a field beneath a giant crucifix, people in black robes and pointed hoods were riding horses around small fires. Nothing about it made sense. They looked almost unreal. The flames made their shadows move across the field. Sometimes I could only see the horses. Then a rider would pass closer to one of the fires, and the black robe would become visible. Then the pointed hood. Then darkness again. I had never seen anything like it. I do not remember hearing voices. Maybe there were voices and I was too frightened to process them. Maybe the window blocked the sound. Maybe they were completely silent. All I remember clearly is the light and the movement, the fires, the huge cross, the riders, the dark robes, the pointed hoods, and the absolute certainty that I was seeing something I was not supposed to see. I wish I could tell you exactly what happened next. I cannot. My memory simply stops. Apparently, I blacked out. I do not mean I remember calmly going back to bed. I remember standing at the window. Then, nothing. The next thing I remember is waking up in my bed the following morning when my mother came in to get me ready for school. My bed was underneath the window, so I assume I collapsed backward onto it. I woke up confused. For a few seconds, the night before felt like a nightmare. Then, I remembered everything. I immediately looked toward the window. The cross was still there. Daylight covered the field now. There were no riders, no black robes, no people. But the area around the cross was not normal. Smoke was still rising from the ground. The small fires had either only recently gone out or were still burning in places. I could see smoke drifting around the field. That was when I knew I had not simply dreamed it. Something had happened outside. Maybe my mind had misunderstood part of it. Maybe fear had made the riders look stranger than they really were. But there had definitely been fires around the cross. The evidence was still there in daylight. I told my mother what I had seen. I do not remember exactly how much she believed at first. Imagine your 11-year-old child telling you that they woke up and saw hooded riders circling fires around a giant cross. It sounds impossible. It sounds like a nightmare. But I was completely serious. Later that day, after school, I went out to look at the area more closely. I probably should not have. But kids are curious, especially when something frightening has happened. I wanted proof. I wanted to know whether what I remembered had really been there. I found horse tracks in the ground. Multiple tracks. There was no question that horses had been in that field. I also found several empty liquor bottles. The ground around the cross showed clear signs that people had been there. The fires had left marks, too. That was enough for me. Something had happened. A group of people had been out there at night with horses and fire. That did not automatically mean they were doing something supernatural. Maybe they were drunk. Maybe they were having some kind of weird private gathering. Maybe it was some strange local tradition. But to a kid my age, it looked like a ritual. And the fact that it happened only a short distance from my bedroom made me feel completely unsafe. My mother was disturbed enough that we did not stay there much longer. We got out. She took what I told her seriously. She also put me in therapy for a few weeks because the whole thing had clearly affected me. That was actually the first time I really talked through the experience. For years afterward, I did not like thinking about it. It had scared me badly enough that I tried to keep it locked away in the back of my mind. Even while we were living there, though, the strange things around that road were not limited to what I saw from my window. There was another place nearby that creeped me out. Across from one of the houses farther down the road, deep enough into the woods that it was not obvious from a distance, there was some kind of greenhouse or old structure. I never fully understood what it was supposed to be. It looked almost like a greenhouse, but inside were pieces of furniture and taxidermy. A lot of it was covered or wrapped in plastic. To a curious kid, that was impossible to ignore. One day, I went exploring. I knew I probably was not supposed to be there, but I was young and curious. I went into the structure to look around. Almost immediately, a man appeared. I had never seen him before. As far as I knew, he did not live anywhere along the road. He was extremely old. At least that is how he looked to me. He might have been close to 100. What really stood out was his clothing. He was dressed in clothes that looked like something a person might have worn in the 1940s. Not modern clothes, old-fashioned clothes. He saw me and became angry immediately. "Hey, kid, you're not supposed to be in here. It's posted property. Get the hell out now." He scared the hell out of me. I did exactly what he said. I ran. I went straight home. I never told my mother about that incident because I knew she would probably be angry with me for wandering around somewhere I was not supposed to be. At the time, I already had enough problems. I did not want to get punished, too. Looking back, there may have been nothing supernatural about the man. He could have been the owner, a relative, a worker. Maybe he just dressed strangely. But in that place, after what I had already seen, he became another part of the atmosphere. Everything around Mitchell Road seemed like it belonged to another time. The old farms, the woods, the cross, the strange structures, the isolated houses. People you did not know, appearing where you did not expect them. For years, I tried not to revisit those memories. This is only one of the very few times I have really talked about them in detail. The first serious time was in therapy. I think part of me was embarrassed by how much the experience affected me. Another part was afraid people would not believe it. And honestly, I understand why they might not. If someone told me they looked out their bedroom window and saw hooded riders around fires beneath the giant cross, I would have questions too. But I know what I saw. And I know there were horse tracks and liquor bottles there afterward. There were fires. There were people. What they were doing is the part I cannot prove. Years later, more strange stories from that road continued to reach me. One that stayed with me involved a young couple. They were involved in a fatal car crash somewhere along Mitchell Road. From what I heard, the crash happened at around 5 in the morning. Nobody found them until about a day later. By then, it was too late. The strange part was that they were not from the area. People who lived nearby did not know them. Even their family, apparently, did not understand why they had been on that road. There was not much reason for outsiders to be there. It was not a shortcut, most people knew. It was not a busy road. It led into a small collection of farms and houses. Why would a young couple who had no connection to the area be driving there around 5 in the morning? Maybe there was a normal explanation. Maybe they were lost. Maybe GPS sent them there. Maybe they were exploring. I do not know. But hearing about it brought back all those old feelings. That road had always felt wrong to me. Then, when I was in high school, I learned something else. The older couple who lived in the really nice house near the lower part of Mitchell Road both worked in my school. The woman was the school nurse. Years after I had moved away, I spoke with her about how strange I had always found the area. By then, I was older. I could talk about it without immediately feeling like the frightened kid standing at the upstairs window. I told her that I always thought Mitchell Road was creepy. She did not seem surprised. Then she told me something I had never heard before. According to her, the old farmer the road had been named after had supposedly been involved in occult practices many years earlier. She said he had a huge family, something like 25 people, including multiple wives. She claimed members of the family would gather near the cross for rituals and sacrifices. According to the story, some of these rituals happened during the full moon. I remember hearing that and immediately thinking about the night from my childhood. The horses, the black robes, the pointed hoods, the fires, the cross. I had not known any of that when I was 11 or 12. Nobody had told me some local legend about occult rituals and then caused my imagination to create something. I saw the gathering first. Years later, someone who had lived there a long time told me that people had supposedly performed rituals in that same area. That connection bothered me. Again, I cannot prove her story was true. Small towns create legends. One strange family becomes an occult family. A religious gathering becomes a ritual. A weird event gets retold until sacrifices are added. I understand how stories develop. Maybe old man Mitchell was simply an unusual farmer with a large family. Maybe people made up the rest. But even if that entire piece of local history was false, it did not change what I personally remembered seeing. There were people in that field. They had horses. They wore dark clothing. There were fires. And they were gathered around that cross in the middle of the night. That much was real to me. The question is what they were doing. As I got older, I tried to think of ordinary explanations. Maybe it was some type of secret social group. Maybe teenagers or adults were intentionally trying to look frightening. Maybe they were drinking and having some kind of party. The empty liquor bottles support that possibility. Maybe the robes were costumes. Maybe the pointed hoods looked different because I was seeing them from far away and through flickering firelight. A frightened child can misinterpret shapes. I know that. The horses are not especially mysterious either. There was a horse farm almost directly across from us. Horses were everywhere in that area. It is entirely possible a group of local people simply took horses into the field and had a strange gathering. But even the ordinary version is disturbing. Why do it around a giant cross? Why in the middle of the night? Why the fires? Why the robes? Why the hoods? What were they actually doing out there? I still do not know. And the fact that the family connected to that land supposedly had a history of ritual gatherings makes the whole thing harder to dismiss. The image that stays strongest in my mind is the cross glowing in the darkness. Before that night, It had just been a strange landmark. Afterward, I could never look at it the same way. During the day, it was only metal, white or silver, blue trim, standing quietly in the field. At night, with flames around it, it looked completely different. The firelight reflected from it. The surrounding field became visible. Dark riders passed in and out of the light. I can still picture the movement of the horses. Sometimes only their legs were illuminated. Then a rider would move closer to the fire and I would see the robe. Then the pointed hood. Then darkness again. It is one of those memories that feels almost like a scene from a movie. Except I was there. I was a child. It was outside my bedroom window. That is why it haunted me for so long. You are supposed to feel safe in your bedroom, especially as a kid. Your room is where you hide from scary things. You pull the covers over your head. You close the door. Whatever frightening thing exists is supposed to stay somewhere else. That night, the frightening thing was outside my window. Not imaginary. Not inside a television. People were really there. Fires were really burning. And I had no idea whether they knew I was watching. That thought came to me later. Did anyone look toward the house? Could they see my face at the upstairs window? Was I visible from the field because of the light outside? Did someone notice me? Maybe that is part of why I blacked out. Maybe it was simply fear. Maybe I had some kind of fainting response. I had never seen anything like that before. My body could have become overwhelmed. All I know is that I remember watching. Then nothing. Then morning. For years, I wondered whether I had imagined the entire thing during some strange, half-awake state. The evidence outside kept me from accepting that explanation completely. The smoke, the burned areas, the tracks, the bottles. Something happened. I think my mother understood that too. That was probably why she was willing to leave so quickly. She did not need to believe in demons or occult sacrifice. She only had to believe that a group of unknown adults was gathering around fires near our home in the middle of the night. That alone was enough reason not to feel safe there with a young child. So we left. I never regretted it. I did not want to stay long enough to find out whether the gathering happened again. I did not want another full moon. I did not want to wake up to that glow. I did not want to look outside and see the riders again. Maybe whatever they were doing had nothing to do with us. Maybe we were never in danger. But I was too young to separate those possibilities. To me, the entire road became connected to that night. The woods felt darker. The horse farm felt strange. The old slaughter area bothered me. The greenhouse with taxidermy became more disturbing. Even the normal houses looked different, because I wondered what the people living there knew. Maybe everyone else thought the gathering was normal. Maybe it had been happening for years. Maybe my mother and I were the only newcomers who did not understand. That possibility was almost worse. Years later, when the school nurse casually mentioned the old stories about Mitchell and the supposed rituals, I remember feeling that same cold feeling again. She said it as though it was part of the area's history. To me, it was confirmation that at least other people believed strange things had happened there. Maybe they were only stories, but they matched my memory too well. I have never been able to completely shake it. There are details I may have remembered imperfectly. Time changes memory. I was young. Fear changes the way people process what they see. I accept all of that, but the central image has never changed. I woke up because light was pulsing through my room. I went to my window. The huge cross in the field was lit. Small fires burned around it. People on horses moved through the darkness. They wore black robes. Their heads were covered by pointed hoods. I watched. Then my memory disappeared. Morning came. The field was still smoking. Later, I found horse tracks and empty bottles. That is what happened. I do not know whether they were occultists. I do not know whether they were sacrificing anything. I do not know whether the story about old man Mitchell and his enormous family was true. I do not know whether the riders I saw were members of that family. Maybe all of those later stories simply attached themselves to something I never understood. But if you ask me what I believe, I think I witnessed some kind of ritual. Maybe not supernatural, maybe not even dangerous, but a ritual. People had gathered deliberately. They were dressed deliberately. The fires were arranged around the cross. They were not simply passing through the field. They were there for a reason. And I still wonder what that reason was. What bothers me most is knowing that I probably never would have discovered any of it if the firelight had not woken me. If I had slept through the night, I might have woken the next morning, seen some smoke in the field, and thought nothing of it. I would have gone to school. Maybe we would have stayed there much longer. Instead, for some reason, I woke up. I looked, and I saw something that frightened me badly enough to affect me for years. Maybe some places simply collect strange stories because they are isolated. Long dirt roads, dense forests, old farms, large families, accidents, rumors. People see one strange thing and add it to everything that came before. That could be all Mitchell Road ever was. A rural place where normal events felt more frightening because there were fewer people around to explain them. But that does not make the memory less disturbing. Even if there was no supernatural explanation at all, I was still a child standing at an upstairs window in the middle of the night, watching hooded riders circle fires around a giant cross. That is enough. I do not need a demon. I do not need a ghost. I do not need to know whether anyone performed an actual sacrifice. The human part of the story is already strange enough. Sometimes I wonder whether the people in the field ever knew I was there. I hope they did not. I hope I was simply a kid in a dark window, invisible to them. I hope they finished whatever they were doing and left, because the idea that one of them might have looked up, seen me watching, and remembered which room I was standing in is something I still do not like thinking about. I left that road a long time ago. But part of me never really forgot it. The woods, the pond, the horses, the cross, the smoke, the old greenhouse, the strange man yelling at me, the stories people told years later. All of it blended together into one place I never wanted to return to. Even now, after all this time, I can close my eyes and see that field in the middle of the night. The fires flickering, the metal cross glowing, dark shapes moving around it, and riders in black robes passing slowly through the light. That is the image that haunted me well into my teenage years. And honestly, after finally talking about it again, I understand why. This happened only 2 or 3 days after my dad died by suicide in our garage. Even now, I do not like thinking about that period of my life. Everything from those days feels mixed together in my memory. Grief, shock, exhaustion, alcohol, family members coming and going, people saying things they thought were helpful, and the house itself feeling completely different from the way it had before. It is hard to explain how much a familiar place can change after something terrible happens inside it. The walls are the same. The furniture is the same. The doors are in the same places. But the feeling is different. Every room suddenly has a memory attached to it. Every sound makes you stop. Every quiet moment becomes heavier. For me, the garage was obviously the worst part. Before my dad died, it had just been the garage, a normal part of the house. Afterward, I could not look at it the same way. It had become connected to the worst thing that had happened to our family. I was still trying to process everything when this strange incident happened. It was nighttime. I was outside the house. I do not remember every detail clearly anymore, and I want to be honest about that. My memory from that period is not perfect. I had been drinking. I was grieving. I was not sleeping normally. Everything was emotionally overwhelming. So I cannot say that every second of what I remember is completely accurate. That uncertainty is actually one of the reasons I rarely talk about the experience. But there are parts of it that have stayed with me. I was outside and looked toward the garage. The garage door opened. I remember stopping and staring at it. There was no obvious reason for it to move. My mother and my aunt were inside the house. As far as I knew, neither of them was using the garage door opener. I could see the opening becoming wider until the garage was exposed. The inside was dark. For obvious reasons, seeing that space open at night only a few days after my dad had died there immediately made me uncomfortable. I stared into it. I could not see anyone standing inside. No person, no movement, nothing that would explain why the door had opened. Then, the light inside the garage turned on. That alone was strange. Then it turned off. Then on again. Then off. It happened several times. It looked exactly like someone was standing inside playing with the light switch. On, off, the light flashing through the open garage made the whole thing look almost unreal. Every time it came on, I could see inside. And every time, I saw no one. That is the image that has stayed with me. The open garage, the darkness outside. Then the interior suddenly lit. Empty. Dark again. Light. Still empty. It felt as though someone invisible was deliberately getting our attention. I do not remember exactly how long it went on. Probably not very long. Fear and grief can make a few seconds feel much longer than they really are. But I remember being deeply unsettled. I knew what had happened in that garage only days earlier. There was no way for me to see the light moving on and off without immediately connecting it to my dad. I think anyone would have made that connection. The mind looks for meaning when something impossible or unexplained happens, especially after a death. Especially when the strange event happens in the same place where the person died. Part of me wondered whether it was somehow him. I do not know if I truly believed that in the moment, or if that idea only became stronger afterward. My thoughts from those days are difficult to separate now. But before I could make sense of what I had seen, my aunt gave her own explanation. My aunt was, and as far as I know, still is, a very strict fundamentalist Christian. She saw the world through that belief system. To her, spiritual events had very clear categories. Something unusual was either connected to God or connected to something evil. There was not much room in between. So when she heard about what happened with the garage, she did not interpret it as my dad trying to communicate with us. She said it was demons. According to her, my dad's death had attracted them to the house. She believed they were there to torment us, to mess with our minds, to use our grief against us. That explanation made the whole experience much worse for me. I was already trying to deal with my father's death. I was already in shock. I was already looking at the garage and thinking about what had happened there. The last thing I needed was someone telling me that evil entities were now hanging around the house because of it. But that was what she believed. She spoke about it like it was obvious. To her, the garage door and the lights were not a mechanical problem. They were not grief making people notice strange things. They were demons deliberately trying to frighten us. I hated that interpretation. I still do. It took something already painful and made it even darker. Instead of allowing the incident to remain unexplained, she gave it the most frightening explanation possible. And because I was emotionally vulnerable at the time, her words stayed with me. Even if I did not completely believe her, once someone puts an image like that in your mind, it becomes difficult to remove. Now the house was not only the place where my dad died. According to her, it was also a place where demons had been drawn by his death. That is a lot to put on someone who is already grieving. The strange thing is that after that night, nobody really talked about the incident. There was no family meeting about it. No one tried to investigate the garage door opener. No one spent days discussing whether the light switch had an electrical problem. The whole thing just disappeared into silence. Maybe everyone was too exhausted. Maybe my mom did not want to talk about anything connected to the garage. Maybe my aunt had said enough. Maybe everyone simply decided there were more important things to deal with. There was certainly no shortage of grief in the house. So the event became one of those strange memories that nobody mentioned again. I carried it quietly. A couple of weeks later, I told exactly one other person about what had happened. That was it. For years, I did not really revisit it. Part of the reason is that I do not trust my own memory of that period completely. I know I had been drinking that night. I do not remember how much. I was under extreme stress. Those things matter. I do not want to pretend they do not. Memory is not a perfect recording. Even under normal circumstances, people remember events differently over time. Add grief, alcohol, lack of sleep, and trauma, and things become even less reliable. So I cannot confidently say that every detail happened exactly the way I remember it. Maybe the garage door opened for some normal reason. Garage door openers can malfunction. Signals can interfere with each other. Someone could accidentally press a remote. Wiring can fail. Mechanical systems do strange things. The light could have had an electrical problem. Maybe the bulb was loose. Maybe the opener itself controlled the light and was malfunctioning. Maybe something about the door opening caused the light to flash. There are plenty of possible explanations. I understand that. I also know that my mother and aunt were in the house. As far as I knew, neither of them had activated the opener. Could one of them have done it without remembering? Possibly. Could I have misunderstood what I saw? Also possible. I cannot rule those things out. That is why I do not tell this story as proof of ghosts or demons. I do not know what happened. I only know how it felt. And the timing made it impossible not to be frightened. If the exact same thing had happened 6 months earlier, maybe I would have laughed. I might have gone inside and complained that the garage door opener was broken. I might have checked the wiring. I might have asked my dad whether he had been messing with the remote. It would have been annoying, but probably not terrifying. But it happened 2 or 3 days after he died in that garage. That changed everything. Context changes fear. A light switching on and off is just an electrical problem until it happens in the room where someone you love just died. A garage door opening by itself is just a mechanical issue until you are standing there grieving and watching the empty space appear in front of you. Then, every ordinary explanation starts competing with the emotional one. Maybe he is still here. Maybe something is trying to communicate. Maybe something else is there. Maybe the house has changed. Those thoughts come quickly. The fact that I could see no one inside made it worse. Every time the light came on, I could look into the garage. There was no figure standing by the wall. No one beside the switch. No person near the door. Nothing. Just an empty garage. That emptiness felt wrong. I think part of me expected to see my dad, even though I knew that was impossible. Grief does strange things to expectations. You know someone is gone. Then you hear a sound they used to make, and for half a second, your brain still expects them to appear. You hear a familiar footstep, a door, a cough, a car. For one tiny moment, the old reality returns. Then you remember. I think the garage incident hit that part of my brain. Some part of me wanted the explanation to be my dad. Another part of me was terrified of that idea. Then my aunt introduced the demon explanation, which made everything more confusing. I do not know what my mother thought. That is another part of this story that remains unresolved. I have never asked her. Even now, I do not want to. I worry that bringing it up would force her to revisit one of the worst periods of her life. Maybe she remembers the incident clearly. Maybe she does not. Maybe she has a completely normal explanation that I never heard. Maybe she thinks I imagined it. Maybe she saw it too. I honestly do not know. And I have decided that knowing is not important enough to risk hurting her. There are some questions that do not need answers if asking them causes more pain. So I have left it alone. That means my version of the memory remains incomplete. I only have what I remember. And I know that memory is imperfect. One thing that makes me less likely to believe something truly paranormal was happening is what happened afterward. Nothing. I stayed in the house for around another 2 weeks before moving out. During that time, I did not experience any other incident like it. No more garage doors opening on their own. No lights flashing repeatedly. No unexplained voices. No footsteps. No objects moving. Nothing that made me think the house was being haunted. There was even a period of 3 or 4 hours when I was completely alone inside the house. I had gone back to clean. That is the kind of situation where, if you already believe something supernatural might be there, your imagination can become extremely active. A house feels different when it is empty, even a familiar one. You hear the refrigerator, the building settling, pipes, cars outside. Every sound seems larger. And in this case, I was alone in the same house where my father had recently died. I knew the garage was there. I knew what my aunt had said. If anything was going to frighten me, that would have been the time. But nothing happened. I cleaned. I moved around the rooms. I spent hours there alone. No demons, no ghostly signs, no strange lights, no garage activity. Nothing that matters to me. If my aunt had been right, and the house had somehow attracted evil entities that were trying to torment us, they apparently gave up after one incident. That does not make much sense. Of course, believers could create an explanation for that too. Maybe they left. Maybe they only wanted to scare us once. Maybe prayer drove them away. There is always another explanation once you start thinking in supernatural terms. But personally, the fact that nothing else happened makes me lean towards something mechanical or something misunderstood. Still, that does not erase the memory. Because what frightened me was not only the question of whether something paranormal happened. It was the emotional timing. The garage had become the center of our grief. Then suddenly it seemed to come alive by itself. The door opened. The light flashed. No one was there. For a person already barely holding things together, that was enough. I sometimes wonder whether my grief made me notice things I would normally ignore. Maybe the garage door opener had always been unreliable. Maybe the light had flickered before. Maybe I simply never cared. After my dad's death, every little thing connected to that space mattered. That is probably true. Trauma makes people hyper-aware. Your nervous system starts looking for danger everywhere. A normal sound can feel threatening. A strange coincidence can feel like a message. That does not mean the experience was fake. It means the meaning we give it can be shaped by what we are going through. I think that is probably the fairest way to describe what happened. Something strange occurred. I saw it. I was frightened. I do not know why it happened. and I do not trust myself enough to make a stronger claim than that. I definitely do not accept my aunt's explanation as fact. Her belief that demons were attracted by my father's death caused me more distress than the actual garage incident. At least the garage was something I could observe. Door open. Light on. Light off. Those are physical events. Her explanation added invisible threats to a situation where none were needed. Suddenly, grief itself became dangerous. My father's death had supposedly opened some kind of door to evil. That was not comforting. It was cruel, even if she thought she was helping. I think that is why I have such a negative feeling attached to the memory. It is not just fear. It is anger, too. The event could have remained one strange night during a terrible week. Instead, it became connected to ideas about punishment, demons, evil, and spiritual danger. For a grieving family, that can be incredibly damaging. No one needs to be told that a loved one's death has invited monsters into the house, especially not immediately afterward. Maybe that was why nobody brought it up again. Perhaps silence was the healthier choice. We had enough to deal with. Funeral arrangements, family, shock, questions that would never be answered. The garage door did not need to become another mystery. So we stopped talking about it, or at least everyone else did. I kept it somewhere in my mind, not as proof of anything, just as one of those memories that never quite disappears. Every once in a while, I think about the light. On, off, and that empty garage appearing and disappearing in the darkness. I remember standing there. I remember knowing my mother and aunt were inside. I remember thinking there should be someone in the garage if the light was being switched. But no one was there. Maybe the entire sequence was shorter or different than I remember. I accept that. I was drinking. I was grieving. This was many years ago. Those facts matter. I have no interest in turning an uncertain memory into a perfect ghost story. There is enough real pain attached to it already. What I can say is that the experience felt completely real in the moment. Real enough that I never forgot it. And even though I did not see anything else strange in the remaining weeks I lived there, that night stayed with me. The absence of later events may actually be one of the strangest things about it. There was no pattern, no escalation, no haunting, just one incident during the worst days of our lives. Then silence. Maybe that is exactly what it was. A coincidence that happened at the worst possible time. A malfunctioning garage door. A light behaving strangely. A grieving mind assigning meaning to it. That explanation is reasonable. Probably more reasonable than anything supernatural. But when I remember standing outside and watching that empty garage light up again and again only days after my father died there, reasonable explanations do not completely remove the feeling. For those few moments, the garage did not seem empty, even though I could see that it was. And that contradiction is what still bothers me. I have never asked my mom what she remembers. I probably never will. I do not want to make her go back there emotionally just to satisfy my curiosity. My aunt gave her explanation long ago, and I have no desire to hear it again. I told one person a couple of weeks after it happened. Then I mostly let the memory stay buried. Maybe that is where it belongs. I do not know what opened the garage door. I do not know what made the light turn on and off. I do not know whether anyone else saw exactly what I saw. I do not know whether my memory has changed over the years. And I definitely do not know whether anything supernatural was involved. All I know is that it happened during a period when my family was already shattered. For a few seconds, an empty garage seemed to behave as though someone was inside. Then it stopped. And in the weeks before I moved out, nothing like it ever happened again. Maybe there is a simple explanation. Honestly, I hope there is. Some memories are disturbing enough without needing anything paranormal added to them. A scary story stays a story instead of becoming something much worse. I have a handful of personal stories that fall more on the paranormal side of things. Over the years, I have seen things that I would probably describe as apparitions, and I have felt strange things that I have never really been able to explain. A lot of this happened when my sister and I were younger, especially between the ages of about 10 and 15. Both of our bedrooms were in the lower level of our house. It was almost like a basement. That part of the house always seemed to have more strange activity than the rest. My sister and I experienced enough odd things down there that, after a while, we became more sensitive to certain places and certain feelings. I do not mean we believed every creak was a ghost. We were still kids, but there were times when we would walk into a room and immediately feel uncomfortable. Sometimes there was no obvious reason. Nothing would move. No one would speak. Nothing strange would happen right away. The place would simply feel wrong. That feeling became familiar to both of us. One of the experiences I remember happened when I was about 12 years old. It was at a friend's birthday party. My friend lived in a very large house. It had several floors, lots of rooms, hallways, closets, stairs, and plenty of places where a group of kids could disappear from each other. For a birthday party, it was perfect. There were about 8 of us there, all girls around the same age. We were preteens, which meant we were old enough to want independence, but still young enough to turn almost anything into a game. My friend's parents were home, but they mostly stayed out of our way. They gave us space. As long as we were not destroying anything or doing something dangerous, they let us entertain ourselves. Most of the party was normal. We talked. We laughed. We probably ate too much junk food. There was the usual loud energy that happens when you put a group of 12-year-old girls together in one house. At some point, somebody came up with the idea of playing hide and seek. That sounded fun. Then somebody made it worse. They wanted to play in the dark. I was not excited about that. I had always been afraid of the dark. Honestly, I still am. It is not necessarily that I think something supernatural is always waiting in a dark room. I just do not like not being able to see what is around me. Darkness gives your imagination too much freedom. A chair becomes a person. A coat becomes a figure. A normal sound suddenly seems much closer than it really is. Even at 12, I knew that about myself. So the idea of running through a huge, unfamiliar house with all the lights turned off was not exactly appealing. My sister was there with me, and I told her that I did not really like the idea. She seemed to feel the same way. There was another reason, too. The house itself made both of us uncomfortable. I cannot point to one thing that caused it. The place was nice. It was large. There was nothing obviously frightening about it. But my sister and I both felt a strange vibe. That is the only way I can describe it. Something about the house felt off. Maybe it was because we were already used to weird things happening at home. Maybe we were more nervous than the other girls. Maybe the size of the house made it feel unfamiliar. Whatever it was, neither of us loved the idea of wandering around it in complete darkness. Of course, we still played. At 12 years old, you do not always want to be the person who refuses to join the game because you are scared. Everyone else was excited. They started turning lights off. The house became darker. Suddenly, the rooms and hallways looked completely different. Places that had seemed normal only minutes earlier became black spaces. Doorways disappeared. Corners became harder to see. The long hallways seemed even longer. Everyone started laughing and trying to scare each other before the game had even properly begun. Eventually, someone was chosen to be the seeker. The rest of us ran off to hide. Girls scattered through the house. Footsteps went in every direction. People whispered. Someone laughed too loudly and was immediately told to shut up. I ran with a couple of the other girls. I had absolutely no interest in hiding somewhere by myself. Apparently, I was not the only one who felt that way. A few of us decided that the safest plan was to hide together in our friend's closet. This was not exactly a brilliant hide-and-seek strategy. If you want to win, putting several giggling preteen girls in the same closet is probably the worst possible idea. But winning was not really what I cared about. I did not want to be alone in the dark. The closet was in one of the bedrooms. It stretched almost the entire length of one wall. Instead of normal doors, it had two large sliding mirrored doors. During the day, it was just a big closet. In the dark, the mirrors made the room feel even stranger. Reflections doubled whatever little light there was. Movement seemed to appear where there was none. We opened one end of the closet. I went inside first. Because I was first, I had to move all the way toward the far end so everyone else would have enough room to get in. I squeezed past hanging clothes and whatever else was stored inside. The farther I moved, the darker it became. There was no direct light once the mirrored doors slid shut. I could feel clothes brushing against me. There were hangers above. Shoes or boxes were probably on the floor. I kept moving until I was pressed near the far side. Then the other girls climbed in behind me. One after another. Everyone tried to fit. There was some quiet laughing. Someone probably told someone else to move over. Eventually, we got the doors closed. Then, we tried to be silent. That is always the hardest part of hiding with friends. At first, every tiny movement seems funny. Somebody breathes too loudly. Someone bumps into a coat. Someone starts giggling, and everyone else tries to make them stop. But after a minute or two, we settled down. The closet became very quiet. I was standing at the far end. The others were grouped closer to the opposite side, near the opening we had used. I could not really see them. It was too dark. I knew they were there because I had watched them come in. I could hear their breathing. Every once in a while, someone shifted slightly. Outside the closet, the house was quiet too. We were listening for the seeker. Maybe we would hear footsteps in the hallway. Maybe a door opening. Maybe someone getting caught. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then, I felt a hand press into my back. It happened suddenly. There was no warning. One moment, I was standing there trying to stay quiet. The next moment, something was touching me. It felt exactly like a hand. Not a coat hanger. Not a piece of clothing. Not some object falling against me. A hand. There was pressure against my back. Distinct, solid, human. At first, I was not even afraid. That is probably the strangest part. My immediate thought was that one of the girls behind me had reached over and touched me. Maybe she was trying to get my attention. Maybe she was trying to scare me. Maybe she needed me to move. The touch felt so real and so normal that my brain automatically assumed there was a person responsible. The pressure stayed there for a few seconds. It did not tap me quickly. It did not brush past. The hand pressed into my back and stayed. Then, it disappeared. I remember standing there for a moment. I was annoyed more than frightened. I thought one of the girls was messing around. So I reached backward. I expected to touch someone's arm, or hand, or shoulder. Nothing. My hand moved through empty space. I reached farther. Still nothing. That was when my body started to realize something was wrong. I whispered, guys. Almost immediately, the other girls answered me. Their voices came from the opposite end of the closet. All of them. Together, far away from where I was standing. That was the moment fear hit me. I suddenly understood that nobody was behind me. The far end of the closet was against the wall. There was nowhere for a person to stand. I had gone in first. I had moved all the way to the end, Everyone else had entered after me and stayed closer to the other side. There should have been nothing between my back and the wall except hanging clothes and the inside of the closet. But I knew what I had felt. A hand. I immediately started trying to figure out another explanation. Maybe a sleeve had fallen against me. Maybe a hanger had pressed into my back. Maybe one of the girls had somehow reached farther than I realized. But the feeling had been too clear. It had not felt like fabric. It had not felt like metal. It had felt warm and solid. It had the shape and pressure of a hand. And when I reached back, there had been nobody there. I did not want to stay and investigate. That was enough for me. I got out of the closet. I was completely done with hide and seek. I did not care whether the seeker saw me. I did not care whether everyone thought I was being dramatic. I wanted the lights on. I wanted people around. I wanted out of that dark closet. The game continued for the other girls. I stopped playing. I tried to act normal, but inside I was shaken. I kept replaying the moment. The pressure. The few seconds it stayed there. The empty space when I reached backward. The other girls answering from the far end. It was not the most dramatic paranormal thing I had ever experienced. There was no ghost standing in front of me. No face in the mirror. No voice. No object flying across the room. But somehow, a physical feeling made it worse. Something had touched me. That is much harder to dismiss than seeing a shadow from the corner of your eye. A shadow can be a trick of the light. A sound can come from another room. But touch feels personal. Something crossed the space between whatever it was and me. That was how it felt. I mostly kept the experience to myself. I told my sister. I trusted her because she and I had already experienced strange things together at home. She knew I was not the type to invent something just to scare people. She also understood what I meant when I said the house had felt wrong from the beginning. We had both noticed it. Neither of us had wanted to play in the dark. After the closet incident, that uneasy feeling seemed more important. Maybe there had really been something strange about the house. Or maybe we had simply been nervous, and that nervousness made me interpret a normal sensation as something supernatural. I have thought about that possibility many times. At 12 years old, in a dark closet, surrounded by hanging clothes, it would be easy to misunderstand what touched you. Maybe a heavy coat shifted. Maybe one of the hangers moved when someone else bumped the clothes. Maybe something pressed against my back in exactly the right way to feel like fingers or a palm. That is possible. I cannot prove otherwise. But I still remember the sensation clearly. It was not a brush. It was pressure. Something pressed into me. It stayed. Then it left. That is what keeps the experience from disappearing into the category of normal childhood fear. If I had only heard a noise, I probably would have forgotten it. If I had only felt something lightly touch my shirt, I might have blamed a coat. This was distinct enough that I immediately assumed a person had touched me. I did not become afraid until I discovered there was no person there. That order matters. The fear did not create the sensation. The sensation came first. Then I investigated. Then I became frightened. Sometimes I think about where exactly the hand touched me. It was somewhere on my back, probably around the middle or upper part. It felt deliberate, not violent, not like something trying to push me forward, just a hand pressed against me. That almost makes it creepier. There was no attack, no attempt to hurt me. It was as if something wanted me to know it was there. Maybe whatever touched me was curious. Maybe it was trying to scare me. Maybe there was nothing paranormal at all. I will never know. The house itself was unfamiliar enough that I never had a chance to build a pattern. I was only there for a birthday party. If I had lived there, maybe I would have noticed other things. Maybe my friend had stories of her own. I do not remember asking. At 12, I was not thinking like an investigator. I wanted to leave the dark room and stay close to people. That was it. The experience gave me the jitters for a long time afterward. Even when nothing else happened that night, I kept thinking about the closet. Every time I walked past the bedroom, I wondered whether something was still inside. The mirrored doors did not help. Mirrors are strange in dark rooms. You catch movement that is only your own reflection. You see shapes behind yourself. The darkness seems deeper in the reflection than in the actual room. After what happened, I had no interest in looking closely at those doors. I also did not want to be alone anywhere in the house. The birthday party was still going on. Everyone else was having fun. I tried to join in. But I was much more aware of the building around me. Every hallway felt darker. Every open doorway looked suspicious. I kept thinking about the strange vibe my sister and I had noticed earlier. Had we picked up on something? Or had we simply been scared because the house was big and unfamiliar? There is no way to know. Our earlier experiences at home may have made us more likely to notice weird feelings. My sister and I had spent years sleeping in a lower level where strange things seemed to happen. We had seen things. We had felt things. Some experiences were harder to explain than others. Because of that, we did not automatically laugh when one of us said a place felt wrong. We had learned to pay attention to those instincts. At the same time, being familiar with paranormal ideas could also make us more likely to interpret ordinary events that way. I understand that now. As an adult, I try to be careful about memory, especially childhood memory. Things can become more dramatic over time. Details can change. You remember the feeling more strongly than the exact sequence. But this particular experience has stayed surprisingly simple in my mind. Dark closet. Friends at the other end, hand on my back. I reach behind me. No one. That is it. There are not many details for my memory to exaggerate. It was such a short event, maybe only 5 or 10 seconds. But sometimes those are the moments you remember the longest. I think physical touch has a lot to do with it. Humans are extremely sensitive to being touched unexpectedly. Even if someone taps you on the shoulder in a crowded room, you immediately turn around. Your body expects the person to be there. When no person is there, the mind does not know what to do with that information. That is exactly what happened to me. I felt a hand. So I expected a person. When I could not find one, I panicked. The most unsettling part is that I did not only fail to see someone, I knew where everyone else was. Their voices came from the opposite end of the closet. They were packed together near the other sliding door. They could not have reached me without me feeling them move closer first. The closet was long enough that I had gone all the way down specifically to make room. There was distance between us. That is why their answers scared me. Guys? Then several voices from the other end. They were all there. None of them was behind me. I got out. Game over. I do not remember whether anyone asked why I quit. Maybe they did. Maybe I made up some excuse. I did not want to tell the whole group. At that age, you never know how people will respond. Some girls might have laughed. Others might have tried to make the situation scarier. Someone might have wanted to go back into the closet and ask the ghost to touch them. I wanted none of that. So I told my sister and left it there. Over time, the memory became one of several strange experiences from that period of my life. It is not the most extreme. It is probably not even the scariest. But it has always stayed with me because of how real the touch felt. There is something about being physically contacted by something you cannot see that is deeply uncomfortable. Even now, if I am in a dark room and feel something unexpectedly touch my back, that old memory comes back immediately. I turn around fast. I always expect to see someone. Usually it is clothing, a curtain, a chair, something normal. But for a second, I am 12 again, standing in that closet, feeling that hand. I've wondered whether the house had some history. Maybe someone had died there. Maybe there had been previous reports of paranormal activity. Maybe my friend knew something and never told us. I never looked into it. I did not even know if there was anything to look into. The house was just the location of a birthday party. I do not remember an address. I do not remember the family's history. So the experience stayed isolated. No legend, no ghost story attached to it, no explanation. In some ways, I prefer that. When people hear a ghost story about a place before something happens, it can influence how they interpret everything. I did not have that. I was simply a scared kid playing hide and seek in the dark. The only unusual thing before the touch was the uneasy feeling my sister and I both had. That could have meant nothing. Then, the hand happened. Maybe the simplest explanation is still the best one. A coat shifted. A hanger moved. Darkness and nerves turned it into something human. I can accept that as a possibility. But it never felt like a hanger. It never felt like clothing. And if something hanging in the closet had pressed against me, I probably would have felt it again when I reached backward. I did not. There was just empty space. I sometimes wonder what I would have done if I had been alone in the closet. That thought is worse. The other girls were nearby. I could hear them. I knew I was not completely alone. Even then, I bailed immediately. If I had chosen a hiding place by myself and felt that hand press into my back, I probably would have screamed loud enough for the entire house to hear. Maybe it was good that I had been a coward about hiding alone. At least I had people nearby. The whole thing lasted only a moment, but it changed the rest of the night for me. I wanted lights. I wanted noise. I wanted to be around my sister. I no longer cared about the game, and I definitely did not care who won. Looking back, the situation is almost funny in one way. A bunch of girls thought the best hiding strategy was to cram into a closet together and try not to giggle. We were probably terrible at hide and seek. But what I remember is not the game. It is those few quiet minutes after everyone stopped laughing. The darkness, the hanging clothes, the mirrored doors closed in front of us, the feeling of a hand slowly pressing into my back. Then, nothing. I still cannot say what caused it. Maybe there is a normal explanation. Maybe there is not. I have had enough strange experiences in my life that I no longer feel the need to force every one of them into a perfect category. Sometimes I simply say, this happened, and I do not know why. That is where this story belongs. I was about 12 years old. I was at a friend's birthday party in a house that already made my sister and me uncomfortable. We played hide and seek in the dark. A few of us hid together in a long closet. I went in first and moved all the way to the far end. After standing quietly for a few minutes, I felt a hand press firmly into my back. It stayed for several seconds. Then it disappeared. I reached behind me. No one was there. I called out to the others. They all answered from the opposite end of the closet. I left immediately. I never figured out what touched me. And even though it was a fairly tame experience, compared with some of the other strange things I have seen or felt, it gave me the jitters for a long time afterward. Maybe it was nothing paranormal. Maybe there was some ordinary explanation hidden in that closet that I never discovered. But I know what it felt like. It felt like a person standing directly behind me had placed their hand against my back. and when I turned around, there was nobody there. My high school was supposedly haunted. That was something almost everyone knew. Students talked about it. Teachers talked about it. Even people who claimed they did not believe in ghosts still seemed to act a little differently when they had to stay late in the building. There were always stories. Someone would hear footsteps in an empty hallway. A teacher would come into a classroom in the morning and find things moved around. Doors would open or close when nobody was nearby. Sometimes people claimed they heard voices when they were alone. I never knew how much of it was true. High schools are perfect places for ghost stories because they are large, old, and full of strange sounds. During the day, you do not notice any of them because there are hundreds of students talking, laughing, opening lockers, moving chairs, and walking through the halls. At night, everything changes. Every little sound stands out. The heating system sounds louder. Pipes make noises. Old doors creak. The building settles. A place that feels completely ordinary during school hours can feel very different once almost everyone has gone home. Our school had an older section that had a particularly bad reputation. That was where a lot of the stories seemed to come from. The building had been expanded over the years, so there were newer sections and older sections connected together. The newer areas were brighter and felt more open. The older part had narrower hallways, older classroom doors, older lockers, and a different kind of atmosphere. It always felt darker there, even during the day. Some of the teachers seemed to take the haunting stories more seriously than the students realized. There were teachers who would try to leave at the same time at the end of the day. They did not like walking out alone. I remember hearing that several of them would wait for each other if they were working late. Maybe they were just being safe. Maybe they did not want to cross the empty parking lot by themselves. But students naturally connected it to the ghost stories. We would joke that the teachers knew something we did not. At the time, I did not think much about it. I had never experienced anything there myself. Then, one winter evening changed that. It was basketball season. We had practice after school, and that particular night practice ran later than usual. By the time we finished, most of the building had already emptied out. It was winter, so it was dark outside early. That made the school feel even quieter. During basketball practice, we were all in the gym. The gym was still bright and noisy. Basketballs were bouncing. Shoes squeaked against the floor. People were talking. Our coach was giving instructions. It still felt like a normal school day. Then practice ended. People started gathering their things. Some students left immediately. Others stayed around for a few minutes talking. I was getting ready to leave when I realized I had forgotten some books in my locker. Normally, that would not have been a problem. I would just walk to my locker, grab them, and come back. The problem was that my locker was upstairs in the older part of the building. I remember considering whether I really needed the books. Part of me wanted to leave them there until the next morning, but I probably needed them for homework or something else that night. So I decided to go get them. I thought I would be gone for only a few minutes. I left the gym and headed toward the older section. The farther away I got from the gym, the quieter the school became. Behind me, I could still hear faint voices and activity. Ahead of me, almost nothing. My footsteps sounded louder than usual. That happens in an empty school. During the day, you never notice the sound of your own shoes. At night, every step echoes. I walked upstairs toward the hallway where my locker was located. When I reached that floor, I tried to turn on the lights. They did not come on. I tried again. Nothing. That immediately made me uncomfortable. Maybe the lights had been shut off automatically. Maybe some kind of timer controlled them. Maybe the switches had been disabled after hours. I did not know. But the hallway was dark. Not completely black, because there was probably some light coming from windows or emergency signs, but dark enough that I could not comfortably walk to my locker without another light source. I stood there for a moment. I seriously considered turning around. The old stories about the school suddenly seemed a lot less funny. I reminded myself that I was only going to my locker. There were still people in the gym. I was not completely alone in the building. I had my phone with me. So I turned on the flashlight. The small beam from my phone lit up the hallway in front of me. It was not much. Phone flashlights are useful, but in a long, dark hallway, they almost make things creepier. You can see only the area directly in front of you. Everything outside that circle of light disappears. I started walking. My locker was farther down the hallway. The rows of lockers on both sides reflected the flashlight slightly. Classroom doors appeared and disappeared as I moved. Every few steps I would glance ahead. Nothing. No movement. No one standing there. I kept telling myself to hurry. Get the books. Go back to the gym. That was it. I reached my locker. I put down my bag and started opening it. The metal door made a familiar sound. For a moment, having something normal to focus on helped. I knew this locker. I used it every day. I knew where my books were. I opened it and reached inside. That was when I heard a door creak. I froze. It came from somewhere nearby. Not downstairs, not far away. A classroom door in the same hallway. The sound was slow, that old, unmistakable creak of a door moving on its hinges. I stopped reaching for my books and turned around. My phone flashlight moved with me. For a second, I could not see anything clearly. Then, I noticed one of the classroom doors. It was open. I stared at it. I was almost certain it had been closed when I walked past. But now, it stood open. The inside of the classroom was dark. No lights had turned on. I could not see anyone inside. I pointed my phone toward it. The beam reached only part of the room. Desks, a wall. Darkness farther inside. No person. I waited. I expected someone to step out. Maybe a teacher had been working late. Maybe a janitor was in there. Maybe another student had stayed behind. No one appeared. I thought about calling out. Hello? But for some reason, I did not. Part of me did not want an answer. I turned back toward my locker. I told myself not to be stupid. There were plenty of normal explanations. A door could move because of air pressure. The heating system could cause it. Someone might have left it partly open. I had probably missed it when I walked past. I needed to stop scaring myself. So I reached back into my locker and grabbed my books. I was trying to move faster now. I did not want to stand there any longer than necessary. Then the classroom door slammed shut. Hard, the sound exploded through the hallway. Bang, I jumped and spun around. The door was closed, completely closed. I stared at it. Still nobody. No footsteps, no voice, no laughter, nothing. My heart was beating much faster now. I remember standing there with my books in one hand and my phone in the other, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told me to leave. I grabbed the rest of what I needed. I was not interested in checking the classroom. There was no chance I was walking over there and opening that door. If someone was inside playing a joke, they could stay there. If it was a teacher or janitor, they could explain it later. And if it was something else, I definitely did not want to find out. I put my books into my bag. Then I heard another sound. A locker door opening behind me. Metal scraping. Then a slam. Bang, I stopped moving. Another locker opened. Then slammed shut. Bang. Then another. Bang. The sounds were coming from behind me. Down the hallway. At first, they were farther away. Then another locker slammed. And another. It sounded like someone was moving along the hallway, opening locker doors and violently shutting them. I turned my flashlight toward the noise. I saw no one. The hallway looked empty. The locker doors seemed closed. Then another one slammed. Closer, that was when I stopped trying to explain anything. I grabbed my bag. I started running. I did not slowly walk away. I did not investigate. I ran. My phone flashlight bounced wildly as I moved. The beam jumped across walls, classroom doors, and lockers. Behind me, I heard another slam. Then, another. Some sounded like classroom doors. Others clearly sounded like metal lockers. Bang, 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 it felt like the noise was following me. Every time I got farther down the hallway, another door slammed somewhere behind me. I did not turn around for long, maybe quick glances. But I was mostly focused on getting back to the stairs. The whole time, I expected to hear footsteps chasing me. I never did. That almost made it worse. If I had heard someone running, I could have told myself it was a person. Instead, there were only doors and lockers, opening, closing, slamming, one after another. I reached the stairwell. I ran down. The noises continued behind me for at least part of the way. I could hear echoes from the upper hallway. I do not know exactly how many lockers or doors moved. It felt like a lot. Fear makes moments stretch. Maybe it was 5, maybe 10, maybe more. I was not counting. I just knew it was not one random locker. It was a sequence, and it seemed to follow me as I left. The closer I got to the gym, the more normal the building felt again. I started hearing voices. The lights were brighter. There were people, real people. A few students were still hanging around, maybe coaches too. The moment I saw them, I felt relief. I walked quickly into the gym area. I probably looked shaken. I do not remember exactly what I told everyone. Maybe I explained it immediately. Maybe I tried to act calm first. But I remember being very glad that people were still there. I did not want to be anywhere in that school alone after that. The strange part is that once I reached the gym, nothing followed. No doors slammed nearby. No lights flickered. Nothing strange happened in front of everyone. The whole experience stayed back in that old hallway. That made me wonder afterward whether I had somehow frightened myself. Maybe there were normal explanations for everything. The hallway lights did not work because they were on an after-hours system. The classroom door could have been moved by air pressure. Old buildings can create strong drafts. A door slamming can change pressure in a hallway and cause other doors or locker doors to move. That is possible. Maybe the heating system had turned on. Maybe changes in air pressure caused several lockers to rattle or slam. I tried to think through explanations like that. But the sequence still bothered me. The classroom door opened, then shut. Then lockers behind me began opening and slamming. Then the sounds continued as I ran away. It felt too deliberate. It felt like something had noticed me. That is what scared me most. Not that the building made noise. Old buildings always make noise. It was the feeling that the activity began after I arrived. I walked into the hallway. Nothing. I reached my locker. A classroom door opened. I looked. Nothing there. I returned to my locker. The classroom door slammed. Then lockers started moving. Then I ran. The noises followed. That felt less like a building settling and more like a reaction. I know that is not proof of anything. Fear can create patterns out of random events. Our brains are very good at connecting things. Maybe several unrelated mechanical events happened at the same time. Maybe I had heard stories about the school being haunted for years, so the second something unusual happened, I interpreted it as paranormal. That is completely possible. But I also know what it sounded like. I had used those lockers every school day. I knew the difference between a pipe making noise and a locker door slamming shut. These were loud, metallic impacts. I heard them clearly. The fact that teachers already did not like staying alone in the building also came back to me afterward. Before that night, I thought it was mostly a joke. Teachers are adults. Why would they be afraid of a high school? Then I remembered how some of them would wait so they could leave together. Maybe there were safety reasons. Maybe it had nothing to do with ghosts. But after what happened to me, I started wondering whether some of them had experienced things they did not talk about with students. Teachers spend more time in schools than most people realize. They arrive before students. They stay after everyone leaves. They work in classrooms when hallways are empty. If something strange happens in a building after hours, teachers are probably the people most likely to notice. I never seriously asked them. Part of me wanted to. Another part did not. I think I preferred not knowing. What if they had laughed? Then I would have felt stupid. But what if they had looked at me and said, "Yeah, that happens up there"? That would have been worse. I still had to attend school every day. I still had to use that locker. The next morning, the hallway looked completely normal. That is another strange thing about places where something frightening happens. Daylight makes everything less threatening. Students filled the hallway. Locker doors opened and closed everywhere. People shouted to friends. Teachers walked into classrooms. The lights worked. That classroom door was just a classroom door again. My locker was just a locker. I stood in almost the same spot where I had been terrified the night before, and it was difficult to believe the two places were actually the same. I looked at the classroom that had opened. Nothing unusual about it. I checked the lockers. Nothing damaged. There was no obvious sign that anything had happened. If someone had told me the story while I was standing there during the day, I might have been skeptical too. But I remembered the darkness. I remembered the phone light. I remembered the first creak. I remembered watching that classroom door sitting open. Then the slam. Then the lockers. Most of all, I remembered running while the sounds continued behind me. For a while after that, I tried not to go into the older part of the building alone, especially after dark. If I forgot something in my locker, it could wait. No book was important enough. If I absolutely had to go, I wanted someone with me. I understood the teachers much better after that. There is a big difference between walking through a school with hundreds of people around and walking through it when almost everyone has gone home. During the day, you feel like you own the building. At night, it feels like you are visiting somewhere you are not supposed to be. The same hallway stretches farther. The shadows seem deeper. Every closed classroom feels like something could be standing inside. And once you have heard a door open by itself, you start watching every one of them. I never saw an apparition that night. I never saw a person. That is probably what made it so frightening. There was nothing to focus on. No figure I could say I saw. No face. No shadow moving toward me. Only physical things reacting around me. A classroom door opened. Then slammed. Locker doors opened and shut. The sounds followed me down the hallway. I could see enough with my phone to know there was no obvious person doing it. If another student had been playing a prank, I never saw them. They never laughed. They never admitted it. And I do not know how one person could have moved along the hallway, opening and slamming several lockers without me seeing them. Maybe it was more than one student. But why would they be hiding in a dark, mostly empty school after basketball practice, just waiting for me? That explanation does not make much sense either. I thought about a janitor. That was more believable. Maybe someone was working in the classrooms. But again, I saw no flashlight. No lights came on. No person stepped into the hall, and a janitor would have no reason to open and slam multiple lockers behind a student who was running away. The normal explanations never fit perfectly. That does not mean ghosts are the answer. It just means I never figured it out. Maybe the building itself caused the whole thing. Old construction, drafts, air pressure, heating systems, metal lockers that did not latch properly. There could be some combination of those things that explains everything. But even if that is true, I still would not want to experience it again. You can know a sound has a normal cause and still be terrified when you hear it chasing you down a dark hallway. And at the time, I did not know the cause. I only knew I was alone. The lights would not turn on. A door opened near me. Then it slammed. Then the lockers started. I think the moment that really broke me was hearing the first locker slam behind me. Up until then, I could still tell myself the classroom door was a draft. One door, one weird event. Fine, but when the locker moved, then another, the whole situation changed. There was activity in more than one place. And it was getting closer. That is how it felt. I remember grabbing my bag without caring how badly I packed books. I just wanted to leave. There was no thought about dignity. No concern that someone might see me running. Fear had taken over completely. I ran as fast as I could. The flashlight beam bounced. The lockers flashed past on either side. The sounds came from behind me. Bang, a few steps. Bang, then another. I never knew which one would move next. For a second, I wondered whether doors in front of me might start opening too. That idea made me run even faster. I did not want to get trapped in that hallway. Once I reached the gym, I finally felt like I could breathe. There were only a few people left, but a few people were enough. I did not care if they thought I was scared. I was. Being afraid felt much better than being alone up there. Eventually, I went home. But the experience stayed in my head. The next time I heard someone say the school was haunted, I did not laugh. I did not necessarily believe every story either. People exaggerate. Students make things up. Old schools create strange sounds. But I understood why the stories existed. I had my own now. I also understood why some teachers wanted to leave together. Maybe they were simply cautious. Maybe nothing paranormal had ever happened to them. But after being alone in that dark hallway, I could not blame anyone for not wanting to walk through the school by themselves. It is one thing to say, I don't believe in ghosts. It is another thing to stand alone in a dark building while something behind you starts slamming doors. Belief becomes less important in that moment. Your body does not care what your opinion on ghosts is. It hears danger and tells you to move. Mine told me to run, so I did. Even years later, when I think about high school, that winter night sometimes comes back to me. Not basketball practice, not the books I needed. The hallway, the phone flashlight, that classroom door slowly creaking open. I remember staring into the dark room and waiting for someone to step out. No one did. Then the slam. Then the lockers. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. What if I had walked over and opened the classroom door? What if I had stood in the hall and waited to see which locker moved? Maybe I would have found some completely ordinary cause. Maybe a loose window was creating a draft. Maybe I would have seen a janitor. Maybe I would have discovered nothing at all. I am fine not knowing. At that age, in that moment, I had no interest in proving anything. I wanted to get back to the gym. And I did. I never saw a ghost. I cannot honestly say that something supernatural happened. But I can say that I walked into an empty, unlit hallway in the supposedly haunted older part of my high school. A classroom door opened by itself. It slammed shut. Then, locker doors began opening and slamming behind me. The sounds continued as I ran toward the gym, and when I finally reached the people still waiting there, I had never been happier to hear other human voices. Whatever caused those noises, I made sure I was never the last person wandering through that part of the school again. 9. A few years ago, my best friend's dad died. It was obviously devastating for the whole family. My friend, her mother, and her brother were all dealing with the loss in their own ways, and after everything that had happened, they decided to get out of town for a few days. They needed space. They needed time away from the house. I understood completely. Before they left, they asked me if I could house sit for them. The main thing they needed was someone to check on the place and feed their dog. I had been friends with the family for a long time, so it was not a strange request. I knew the house well. I had been inside countless times. I knew where everything was, and I was comfortable there. At least, I had always been comfortable there before. I agreed without thinking much about it. The trip was only going to last a few days, so I figured I would stop by, take care of the dog, make sure everything looked okay, and maybe help with a few things around the house. The timing was right in the middle of July. This was in North Carolina, so July meant heat, real heat. The kind of humid summer weather where you walk outside and immediately feel the air stick to your skin. The days were hot enough that the house would stay warm even with the air conditioning running. That detail became important later. One day while I was there, I decided I would do a little extra cleaning. The family had gone through a lot, and the last thing I wanted was for them to return from a painful trip and immediately have chores waiting for them. There was some laundry sitting around, so I decided to wash it. I also picked up the living room a little. Nothing major. I was not trying to completely clean the house. I just wanted to make things easier for them. The house was quiet that day. The dog was there, of course, but otherwise I was completely alone. I had been alone there before. There was no reason to feel uncomfortable. It was daylight. It was the middle of summer. Nothing about the situation seemed frightening. I put the clothes into the washing machine and started the cycle. Then, I had to wait. I figured I could read for a while until the washer finished, then move everything into the dryer before I left. I remembered there were some magazines upstairs, so I decided to go get one. I walked toward the staircase and started climbing. Almost immediately, I felt something change. It is difficult to explain because nothing actually happened at first. No sound, no movement, no voice. But as I went upstairs, I suddenly felt an intense sense of dread. It came out of nowhere. One moment, I was thinking about laundry and choosing something to read. The next moment, every part of me was telling me that I should not be up there. The feeling was strong enough that I slowed down. I remember becoming much more aware of the house. The silence, the open doors, the empty rooms. I tried to ignore it. People get strange feelings sometimes, especially in someone else's house when they are alone. And considering what the family had just gone through, maybe I was emotionally affected without realizing it. Their father had recently died. I knew what had happened. I knew the family was grieving. Maybe my mind was connecting the house with that sadness. That was a reasonable explanation. Then I noticed the temperature. It was cold upstairs, not a little cooler. Cold, that made no sense to me. It was July, in North Carolina. Outside, the heat was brutal, and everyone knows that warm air rises. If anything, I expected the upstairs level to be warmer than the first floor. Instead, the difference was obvious. As I reached the top of the stairs, the air felt unnaturally cold against my skin. I stopped for a moment. I remember thinking that maybe the air conditioning was stronger upstairs. That was possible. Maybe there was a vent nearby. Maybe the thermostat was set lower than I realized. There had to be some normal explanation. Still, it added to the sense that something was wrong. The cold was not comfortable. It felt wrong. Combined with the sudden dread, it made me want to turn around immediately. But I was already upstairs. I only needed a magazine. So I told myself not to be ridiculous. I walked down the hall and found one. I do not remember what magazine it was. Whatever it was, I grabbed it quickly. I did not stay upstairs. I did not look around. I did not go into multiple rooms. I took the magazine and headed back toward the staircase. The whole time, I felt like I should leave that part of the house. I cannot say I felt watched exactly. It was more like my body had decided that something was unsafe, even though my eyes could not find any danger. I went downstairs. The moment I reached the first floor, I felt better. Not completely relaxed, but better. It was warmer downstairs, more normal. The living room felt familiar. I told myself I had simply gotten nervous for no reason. I sat down on the couch with the magazine. The washing machine was still running. I planned to read for a few minutes. Once the cycle finished, I would put the clothes into the dryer and then probably leave. Everything was fine. I opened the magazine. I started reading. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. The house was quiet except for the normal sounds you expect. The washing machine running, maybe the air conditioning, the dog moving around somewhere. Normal household noises. I slowly started to calm down. I even felt a little stupid for how strongly I had reacted upstairs. Maybe the cold really had just been the air conditioning. Maybe the dread was because I was alone. Maybe I had been thinking about my friend's father without realizing it. There was no reason to turn a strange feeling into something supernatural. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. I stopped reading. At first, I was not sure what I had heard. I sat completely still. Then it happened again. Footsteps. Someone was walking upstairs. Not a random creak from the house. Not one floorboard popping. It sounded like a person moving. Step, 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 I lowered the magazine. I listened. The house had been empty when I arrived. I knew that. My friend was out of town. Her mother was out of town. Her brother was out of town. There should not have been anyone upstairs. All of the upstairs doors were open. I had just been there. I would have noticed someone. I had walked through enough of the area to know I was alone. The footsteps continued. They sounded like pacing, back and forth. Slow movement overhead. I tried to tell myself it was the house. Old homes make noises. Wood expands and contracts. Air conditioning can cause floorboards or ductwork to shift. Maybe the dog was upstairs. But these sounds had rhythm. They sounded heavy enough to be human. Then the pacing changed. The footsteps seemed to move toward the stairs. That was the moment my fear became much stronger. I stared toward the staircase. I could not see the upper landing clearly from where I was sitting. But I could hear the movement. Step, 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 coming closer. I remember feeling completely frozen. The magazine was still in my hands. I did not want to move. I was listening so hard that every other sound in the house seemed to disappear. The footsteps reached the area near the top of the stairs. Then they sounded like they were coming down. One step, then another. I did not stay to find out what was making them. Every reasonable thought I had disappeared. I got up, fast. I did not go investigate. I did not call upstairs. I did not check whether the dog was somehow making the sound. I did not wait for the washing machine. I got out of the house. I left the laundry sitting in the washer. That is how quickly I left. The whole reason I had stayed was to move the clothes into the dryer. I did not care anymore. Wet clothes could sit there. Someone else could deal with them. At that moment, getting out of the house mattered more than anything. I grabbed what I needed and left. I remember the feeling of relief once I was outside. Hot July air hit me immediately. Normally, that kind of heat would have been uncomfortable. That day, it felt good. It felt real. normal, the temperature outside made the cold upstairs seem even stranger. I stood there for a moment, probably trying to convince myself that I had overreacted. Maybe there had been a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe the dog had gone upstairs and I had not noticed. Maybe the sound came from the air conditioning system. Maybe someone outside had created an echo. Maybe the house shifted. But I did not go back inside. That says a lot about how real the experience felt. When you only hear one strange sound, curiosity usually wins. You check. You look around. You try to solve it. I had no interest in solving this. The feeling upstairs had already put me on edge. The cold had been wrong. Then the footsteps started while I was downstairs. And when they sounded like they were approaching the stairs, my body made the decision for me. Leave. So I did. I never told my friend's family what really happened with the laundry. At least, not at the time. When they came back from their trip, they found the clothes still sitting in the washing machine. From their point of view, the explanation was simple. They assumed they had started a load before leaving town and forgotten to move it into the dryer. They thought it was their mistake, and I let them believe that. I did not exactly want to tell my best friend, who had just lost her father, that I thought something had been walking around upstairs while her family was away grieving. What good would that have done? They were already dealing with enough. I did not want to make the house feel frightening to them. I did not want her mother worrying that something strange had happened immediately after her husband's death. And I definitely did not want to suggest that the footsteps were connected to him. I had no way of knowing that. Maybe they had nothing to do with him. Maybe they were not paranormal at all. So I kept quiet. As far as the family knew, they had simply forgotten a load of laundry. I always thought that part was almost funny later. They probably blamed themselves for leaving wet clothes sitting for days. Meanwhile, I knew exactly why those clothes were still there. I had been the one who started the wash. I had fully intended to finish it. Then I heard footsteps coming down the stairs in an empty house and decided that clean laundry was no longer important. There is one part of the experience I still think about a lot. The cold. If I had only heard the footsteps, I would have a much easier time dismissing everything. Houses make noises. Dogs make noises. Pipes and air vents can create sounds that resemble walking. But the cold upstairs happened before I heard anything. I had gone up there with no expectation of something strange happening. I was not trying to contact anyone. I was not thinking about ghosts. I was thinking about magazines. Then I reached the second floor and immediately felt dread. And the temperature changed. Maybe the air conditioning system was simply designed that way. Maybe upstairs vents were stronger. Maybe the thermostat was located somewhere that caused the second floor to cool more than the first. I never checked. There are certainly normal possibilities. But when I remember it, the cold did not feel like normal air conditioning. It felt localized, heavy, like walking into a completely different environment. And the dread came with it. That is what makes the memory stick with me. Our bodies sometimes notice things before we consciously understand them. Maybe I heard a sound upstairs that I did not consciously register. Maybe there was a smell. Maybe the air pressure felt different. Maybe all of those subtle details combined and created the feeling that something was wrong. That would make sense. But whatever caused it, the reaction was immediate. I wanted to leave the second floor almost as soon as I reached it. I only stayed long enough to grab something to read. Then the footsteps seemed to confirm the fear. I have wondered whether I should have checked. Part of me wishes I had. Maybe I would have discovered the dog walking around. Maybe a window was open and moving something. Maybe there was a very simple cause. Knowing would have made the story less mysterious. But another part of me is glad I did not. I was alone. If there had actually been a person in the house, investigating would have been stupid. Someone could have broken in before I arrived. Maybe they were hiding upstairs. That possibility is honestly more frightening than a ghost. Imagine going upstairs, feeling that something is wrong, grabbing a magazine, and leaving without noticing someone hiding in one of the rooms, then sitting downstairs while they start moving around. I do not think that is what happened. The upstairs doors were open. I had seen enough to believe the house was empty, but at the time, I could not be certain. Leaving was the safest choice either way. There is also the timing. My friend's father had died only a few years before this experience, and the family was specifically out of town because they needed time to grieve and heal. The house was connected to him. His absence was probably everywhere. His belongings, his usual spaces, the silence where his voice used to be. Maybe being there alone made me more aware of that than I realized. Grief changes places, even for people outside the immediate family. When someone dies, you enter their home and notice the empty chair, the shoes that will not be worn again, a photograph, a jacket. Normal objects suddenly carry emotional weight. Maybe I picked up on that sadness. Maybe the dread upstairs was psychological. I think that is possible. But psychology does not fully explain the footsteps, at least not to me. I heard them clearly enough that I thought someone was moving upstairs. They paced, then approached the staircase, then started coming down. That was not a vague feeling. It was sound. I cannot prove there was anything supernatural causing it. But something made those noises. And whatever it was, I did not stay to meet it. I still laugh a little when I think about how quickly I abandoned the laundry. 1 second, I was trying to be helpful. The next, I was basically saying, forget the clothes, I'm leaving. There was no internal debate. No thought like, I should at least wait 10 more minutes. No, the moment those footsteps seemed to start down the stairs, I was done. I think anyone who has ever been alone in a house and heard movement where no one should be understands that reaction. The logical part of your mind can make a list. Pipes, pets, wood, wind, the emotional part says someone is there. And when your body believes that, logic has very little power. I left before whatever was making the sound reached the bottom of the stairs. I never saw anything. That is important. No apparition, no shadow, no figure, no door moving. Just the cold, the dread, and the footsteps. Sometimes I think not seeing anything made the experience worse. If I had seen the dog come around the corner, the mystery would have ended. If I had seen a loose object moving, I would have understood. Instead, I left while the cause was still upstairs. That means my memory ends with the question unanswered. What would I have seen if I had stayed? Probably nothing dramatic. Maybe the stairs would have remained empty. Maybe the footsteps would have stopped. Maybe I would have laughed at myself. But I did not stay. So the question remains. I also never asked the family whether they had experienced anything strange in the house. Again, the circumstances made that feel inappropriate. My best friend's father had died. I was not going to start asking whether they thought he was haunting the upstairs. That would have been insensitive. Maybe years later I could have brought it up. I never did. Part of me did not want to know. What if they said no? Then I could dismiss my experience as some weird combination of nerves and house noises. That might actually be comforting. But what if they said yes? What if my friend told me they heard footsteps too? What if her mother said the upstairs became cold after her husband died? That would make the memory much harder to explain. Sometimes ignorance is easier. So I kept the story mostly to myself. And every now and then I thought about those wet clothes. They became a strange little piece of evidence that the event had actually happened. The family believed they forgot the laundry, but I knew they had not. I put it there. I started the machine. I was supposed to move everything into the dryer. I left because I was scared. That detail anchors the memory for me. It was not a dream. It was not something I remembered after waking up. I had physically been doing a chore, then something frightened me enough that I abandoned it. I can still picture sitting on the couch with the magazine. I can imagine the quiet room, the washer running somewhere in the background. Then that first step overhead, the way I stopped reading, the way I waited. Another step, then another. I remember listening as the sound moved. That is probably the most unsettling part. It did not sound random. It seemed to have direction. Pacing first, then toward the stairs, then down. Almost as though whoever was upstairs had noticed I was downstairs. I know that interpretation might only exist because I was frightened, but it is how the sequence felt. Something was moving above me. Then it came toward me. I left. Even now, I think that was the right decision. Maybe I ran from nothing. That is fine. There is no prize for being brave enough to investigate strange footsteps in an empty house, especially when you are alone. Sometimes the smartest response to fear is simply to remove yourself from the situation and think about it later. That is what I did. And later, when I was calm, I could come up with all the explanations I wanted. The heat, the air conditioning, the house settling, the dog, my emotions. None of them completely erased how the moment felt. The upstairs was cold. I felt dread before anything happened. Then I heard footsteps. They moved toward the stairs. That was enough for me. The experience never turned into anything bigger. I did not start seeing ghosts afterward. Nothing followed me home. There was no dramatic supernatural event. It was simply one strange afternoon inside a grieving family's empty house. Maybe that is why it still bothers me. There was no conclusion, no explanation, no final reveal. I left. The clothes stayed in the washing machine. The family returned days later and assumed they were responsible, and I never corrected them. To this day, they probably still think they forgot to move that laundry before they left town. They did not. I did. And the reason I never put it in the dryer was because, on a hot July day in North Carolina, I walked upstairs in their empty house and found it strangely cold. I felt an immediate sense that something was wrong. Then, a few minutes later, while sitting alone downstairs, I heard someone pacing above me. The footsteps moved toward the staircase. Then they started coming down. I decided I did not need to know who or what was making them. I just got the hell out of there. About 4 years ago, I went on a cruise with my best friend. At the time, it was supposed to be nothing more than a fun vacation. We had both been looking forward to getting away, and once we were on the ship, we definitely made the most of it. We partied. We drank. We gambled. We went shopping during our stops in Mexico. We stayed up late, slept in when we could, and generally treated the entire trip like a break from real life. Nothing about the cruise felt creepy to me at first. I had never been the kind of person who regularly experienced paranormal things. I did not go onto the ship expecting ghosts. I was not researching haunted cruise ships before we left. I was not looking for strange activity. As far as I was concerned, it was a floating hotel with bars, casinos, restaurants, shops, and thousands of people trying to have a good time. Our room had a balcony. There was a glass patio door leading outside, and like most cruise ship balcony doors, it was heavy. You could not casually brush against it and have it swing open. At least, that was my experience. You had to pull it properly. When you shut it, you had to make sure it closed firmly. The door was designed to stay closed because the ship was moving, wind could get strong outside, and obviously you did not want a balcony door sliding open in the middle of the night. That detail is important because of what happened later. One night, my friend and I had been drinking heavily. And when I say heavily, I mean I had way too much vodka. I do not remember every part of the evening clearly. I remember partying. I remember drinking. At some point, I got back to the room and passed out. There was no graceful transition into sleep. I was drunk enough that I basically collapsed into bed and was gone. My friend went to sleep too. The room was dark. The ship was moving through the night. I have no idea how long I had been asleep when I suddenly woke up. I checked the time or had some sense that it was somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning. What woke me, I do not know. There was no alarm. No one called my name. I simply came out of a dead sleep. The first thing I noticed was that the patio door was open. I lay there for a second, trying to understand what I was looking at. The dark opening toward the balcony was obvious. Maybe I could hear the air moving through the room. Maybe there was a little noise from outside. I do not remember exactly. But I remember thinking that the door should not have been open. I looked toward my friend. She was asleep. She was not standing near the balcony. She had not just come inside. As far as I could tell, she had not moved. I got out of bed. I was still half asleep and probably still drunk, so my brain was not working at full speed. Even then, I thought it was weird. That door was not something that normally opened on its own. You had to shut it hard. Once it closed, it locked from the inside. At least, that was how I understood it. So seeing it open in the middle of the night immediately felt wrong. But I was too tired to turn it into a big mystery. I did not search the balcony. I did not wake my friend. I did not start checking the room. I walked over, closed the patio door, made sure it was shut, and went back to bed. Within minutes, maybe even seconds, I was asleep again. I wish that had been the end of the story. Sometime later, I woke up again. Just like before, it was sudden. 1 second, I was completely asleep. The next, my eyes were open. I did not slowly wake up. I did not hear a sound and sit up. I simply opened my eyes. And there was a man standing at the end of my bed. Even now, I get chills thinking about what he looked like. He was mangled, bloodied. His body looked damaged. His head was crooked strangely to one side, as though his neck was injured or broken. He was standing there at the foot of the bed, looking directly at me. I froze. There was no time to scream at first. My brain could not process what I was seeing. I remember thinking that I had to be dreaming. That was the only explanation that made sense. I had been drinking heavily. It was the middle of the night. I had just woken up. Maybe my brain had not fully left a dream. Maybe I was seeing some leftover image from sleep. So I blinked. I expected him to disappear. He did not. The man was still there, still standing at the end of the bed, still staring at me. That was when the fear really hit. I looked at him again. He looked solid enough to be real. He was not a quick shadow. He was not something I saw from the corner of my eye. He did not disappear the second I focused on him. I had time to look. I had time to understand that his body was badly injured. I had time to notice the blood. I had time to notice the unnatural angle of his head. And I had time to realize that he was watching me. I did what any completely rational adult would do in that situation. I pulled the blanket over my head. Because apparently some part of my brain believed a blanket would protect me from a mangled dead man standing at the end of a bed. Looking back, it sounds ridiculous. At the time, it felt like the only thing I could do. I did not want to look at him again. I did not want to see whether he had moved closer. I did not want to reach for the light. I did not want to wake my friend and possibly find out she could not see him. I just wanted him gone. So I hid under the covers. My heart was pounding. I remember trying to convince myself that I had been dreaming. I told myself the alcohol was messing with me. I told myself I was half asleep. I told myself that if I just went back to sleep, everything would be normal in the morning. Somehow, I managed to force myself back to sleep. I do not know how. Fear usually keeps you awake. Maybe the alcohol helped. Maybe I was so exhausted that my body shut down again. Whatever the reason, I eventually fell asleep with a blanket pulled over my head. When morning came, the room looked normal. Daylight has a way of making nighttime experiences seem impossible. The balcony was just the balcony. The beds were normal. There was no blood, no man, nothing standing at the foot of my bed. I woke up and immediately remembered what had happened. I remember lying there thinking about how I was going to tell my friend. Part of me was already embarrassed. What was I supposed to say? Hey, last night I got drunk and saw a mutilated man staring at me. She probably would have assumed I had been dreaming. Honestly, I would not have blamed her. I was preparing to explain it when she spoke first. Before I could tell her anything, she said something strange had happened to her too. She told me she had woken up in the middle of the night. When she did, the bathroom light was on, and the faucet was running. That got my attention immediately. I asked her what she meant. She said she woke up and noticed the bathroom light had somehow been turned on. The faucet was also on. As far as she knew, neither of us had left it that way. That was when I freaked out. Until that moment, I had almost convinced myself that the man had been some kind of alcohol-related dream, a hallucination, sleep paralysis, something my brain created because I had woken suddenly in the middle of the night. But now my friend was telling me that something strange had happened while she was asleep too. So I told her everything. I told her about waking up and finding the patio door open. I told her I had closed it. Then I told her about waking again. The man. The blood. His damaged body. His head hanging crooked to one side. The way he stood at the foot of my bed staring at me. The fact that I blinked and he did not disappear. The fact that I hid under my blanket like a terrified child. My friend was understandably freaked out. Now we had several strange things from the same night. The patio door, the bathroom light, the running faucet, and the man I had seen. None of those things necessarily proved anything. We had been drinking. Maybe one of us had opened the patio door earlier and forgotten. Maybe my friend had gotten up during the night, used the bathroom, and left the faucet running without remembering. Maybe I had experienced a vivid hypnopompic hallucination while waking from sleep. There are normal possibilities for every part of the story. I know that. Especially the man. The fact that I had been drinking a huge amount of vodka matters. Alcohol can destroy sleep quality. It can make dreams more vivid. It can cause people to wake confused. And when you wake suddenly from deep sleep, the brain can sometimes produce incredibly realistic images. I understand all of that now. But knowing those explanations does not change the memory. I swear I saw him. I can still picture him. He did not look like a vague human shape. He looked injured, destroyed, bloody, and the angle of his head was one of the worst parts. There was something physically wrong with the way it rested against his body. It immediately made me think of a severe neck injury. He did not speak. He did not reach for me. He did not move. He only stood there. Sometimes I think that made him worse. If he had rushed toward me, maybe I would remember the event as an obvious nightmare. Instead, he simply watched. That made the image feel deliberate, like he wanted me to see him. The rest of the cruise continued, but the room never felt exactly the same to me. I started paying more attention to things. The bathroom, the balcony door, sounds at night, any movement that woke me. I do not remember seeing the man again. Nothing else happened that was as dramatic as that night. But I could not completely relax. Every time I looked at the foot of the bed in darkness, I half expected him to be there. I also kept thinking about the patio door. That bothered me almost as much as the apparition. If it had really been closed and locked when we went to bed, how did it open? Could wind have done it? Maybe ships move. Pressure changes. Mechanical things fail. Maybe it had not fully latched, even though I thought it had. Maybe one of us opened it while drunk and forgot. That explanation is probably more likely. Still, waking up and seeing the dark balcony exposed to the room felt strange. There is something unsettling about an open door at night when you know you left it closed. It creates the feeling that something came in. I tried not to think about that connection. Door opens. Later, I see a man. No, I did not need that thought while I was still sleeping in the same cabin. Eventually, the cruise ended. We got off the ship. Once I was back home and away from the whole environment, curiosity got the better of me. I started searching online. I looked up the ship. I searched for stories about strange experiences on board. What I found made the whole thing worse. According to stories and accounts I found online, other people had claimed to experience paranormal activity on that ship. There were reports of strange things happening in cabins and around other parts of the vessel. I also found stories saying that people had gone overboard from the ship over the years, including incidents involving suicide. I cannot personally verify every story I read. The internet is full of rumors. Ships carry enormous numbers of passengers over many years, and stories can become exaggerated. I know that. But at the time, seeing those accounts after what happened to me was terrifying. I had not known about any of them before the cruise. That was important to me. I did not board the ship already thinking it was haunted. I had no ghost story in my mind that could influence what I saw. I did not know about people supposedly dying or going overboard. I only learned those things afterward. And once I did, I started thinking about the man again. Who was he? Was the image completely created by my brain? Or had I seen someone connected to the ship? If he had died there, what had happened to him? Had he fallen? Had he been injured somehow? Had his neck been broken? Those questions started bothering me. I never found an answer. I did not find a photograph and say, that's him. There was no perfect ending like that. And honestly, I am glad. That would probably have frightened me even more. So I am careful when I tell this story. I do not say that I definitely saw a ghost. I cannot prove that. I was drunk. I had been asleep. Those two facts alone create plenty of room for a normal explanation. What I can say is that I had never experienced anything paranormal before. Nothing like it. And I have never forgotten the way that man looked. There is also the fact that my friend experienced something strange independently. She told me about the bathroom before I told her about the man. That matters to me. If I had told her my story first, and then she suddenly remembered something strange, I might wonder whether I influenced her. But she spoke first. She woke up to the bathroom light and faucet being on. Then I told her what I had seen. Maybe both events were unrelated. That is completely possible. Maybe she turned on the bathroom light and faucet while half asleep. Maybe I dreamed the man. Maybe we were both simply recovering from a night of heavy drinking. The rational explanation is easy enough. But the timing is still uncomfortable. Sometimes I wonder whether there was something about that room. Cruise ship cabins are used by thousands of people over the years. You sleep in a bed where countless strangers have slept. You stand on a balcony where other people have stood during some of the best or worst moments of their lives. Most of us never think about that. Hotel rooms are the same. A room feels like yours while you are staying there, but it has a history you know nothing about. Maybe nothing significant had ever happened in our cabin. Probably not. But after seeing that man, I could not stop wondering. I also think the isolation of being on a ship adds to the fear. When you are in a hotel on land and something scares you, part of you knows you can leave the building. You can walk outside, get in a car, go somewhere else. On a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean, you are not leaving. Your room is your room. The hallway leads to another part of the ship. Outside the balcony is nothing but ocean. That knowledge makes strange things feel more trapped. If I had really believed there was something in our cabin, what were we supposed to do? Ask for another room and tell the staff a bleeding dead man was standing by the bed? I can imagine how that conversation would go. So I tried to laugh about it. My friend and I talked about how ridiculous my reaction had been. The blanket over my head was definitely the funniest part. I am an adult. I see what looks like a dead man standing in my room. And apparently my survival strategy is the same one I would have used at age 6. Hide under the covers. Problem solved. Of course, it is funny now. It was not funny then. Under that blanket, I was genuinely terrified. I remember refusing to look out again. What if I pulled the blanket down and he was closer? That thought crossed my mind. Maybe his face would be inches from mine. Maybe he would be standing beside the bed instead of at the end. No chance. I stayed hidden. Even now, I am not sure what I would do differently. Scream, probably. Wake my friend. Turn on every light. Leave the room. All of those would be more useful than hiding. But fear does not always produce useful behavior. Sometimes you become a child again. The image of his head is the part I remember most. Crooked, wrong, there are certain visual details the brain holds on to. I do not remember every piece of clothing he wore. I do not remember his exact age. I could not give a perfect description of his face. But I remember the blood, the damage, and that head tilted unnaturally to one side. When I searched the ship afterward and read stories involving deaths, I immediately wondered whether the appearance meant something. Maybe he looked the way he died. That is a common idea in ghost stories. But again, that thought came after the experience. At the time, all I knew was that he looked horribly injured. I also considered whether the experience could have been sleep paralysis. I had heard about people waking and seeing figures. Some see shadow people. Some see someone standing beside the bed. Others feel a presence in the room. That sounded very similar. But I do not remember being unable to move. Actually, I moved enough to pull the blanket over my head. So if it was related to sleep paralysis, it was not the classic version where your entire body is frozen. It could still have been some kind of waking dream. The brain can do incredibly strange things around sleep. That is probably the explanation I would choose if someone forced me to pick one. Alcohol disrupted sleep. A vivid waking hallucination. That is reasonable. But there is a difference between understanding that explanation intellectually and remembering what I saw. When I remember that night, I do not remember thinking, this looks like a hallucination. I remember thinking there was a man at the end of my bed. The fear was immediate, because he looked real. That is why I still say I saw him. Whether he existed outside my brain is another question. The bathroom incident stays unresolved, too. My friend did not know why the light was on. She did not know why the faucet was running. Maybe she had gotten up and forgotten. Maybe I had. We had both been drinking. We could have done things without remembering them clearly. It happens. Still, hearing her tell me that before I spoke made my stomach drop. It made the night feel less private. It was no longer only something that happened inside my head. Something unusual had disturbed her sleep too. Then there was the balcony door. 3 separate things. One cabin, one night. Maybe coincidence, maybe alcohol, maybe bad sleep, maybe something else. I will probably never know. There were no cameras in the room that I could check. No witness saw the man. No physical evidence remained in the morning. The bathroom could be turned off. The balcony door could be closed. Everything returned to normal. All I was left with was the memory and the online stories I found afterward. I try not to give those online stories more weight than they deserve. Any large cruise ship that has operated for years will collect rumors. People tell stories. Passengers die for many reasons. Accidents happen. Some people, unfortunately, go overboard. Some take their own lives. That does not automatically mean a ship is haunted. But when you have just experienced something you cannot explain, you look at those stories differently. Before the cruise, I would probably have read them for entertainment. Afterward, I kept wondering whether one of them explained the man. I never found out. Maybe that is why the experience still bothers me. There was no resolution, no explanation that completely closed the door. I can give myself rational possibilities, but I cannot prove any of them. I cannot prove the supernatural explanation either. So the memory stays exactly where it has always been, in between. I saw something. I do not know what it was. That is all I can honestly say. Years later, certain things still bring the memory back. A dark hotel room, the sound of a sliding patio door, waking suddenly in the middle of the night. Sometimes I look toward the foot of the bed before I even realize why I am doing it. Nothing is ever there. But for a second I remember him, standing still, bloodied, head crooked, watching me. I think the fact that I had never had a paranormal experience before made it harder to process. People who regularly believe they see ghosts might have a framework for something like that. I did not. I was not prepared. I had no idea what I believed. I only knew I saw something that should not have been there. Then I went home and discovered that other people had supposedly experienced strange things on the same ship. That was enough to make me uncomfortable. I still do not know whether those stories were accurate. I still do not know whether the man had any connection to them. But I know what happened in that room from my perspective. I went to sleep after drinking far too much vodka. I woke around 2 or 3 in the morning. The heavy patio door was open even though I believed it had been shut. My friend was asleep. I closed the door. I went back to bed. Later, I woke again. There was a mangled, bloody man at the foot of my bed. His head was tilted unnaturally. He stared at me. I blinked. He remained. I hid under the blanket and somehow forced myself back to sleep. In the morning, before I told my friend any of this, she told me she had woken during the night to find the bathroom light on and the faucet running. After the cruise, I searched online and found stories claiming the ship had a history of paranormal experiences and deaths. Those are the facts as I remember them. Maybe alcohol explains everything. Maybe my friend and I both moved around in our sleep. Maybe I experienced an extremely vivid waking dream. I would honestly prefer that explanation. But there is one thing I cannot talk myself out of. For those few seconds when I was staring toward the foot of that bed, I was awake enough to question what I saw. I thought I was dreaming. So I blinked. And he was still standing there. That is the moment I always come back to. Not the online stories. Not the faucet. Not even the open balcony door, the blink, because I expected him to disappear. I wanted him to disappear. He did not. He stayed exactly where he was, staring at me. And even 4 years later, remembering that moment still gives me chills.